The scream tore through the gray hush of dawn, and Lyra Ashwood was already running before her mind had fully caught up with her feet. She knew that sound. She had spent 5 years training herself to recognize every warning sign this palace could offer, every shift in tone that meant danger was close, and this sound was the worst one she knew. It was the sound of a wolf breaking free of its human mind entirely, claws raking through soil, a body far too large and far too powerful crashing through wood and stone, as though they weighed nothing at all. Her bare feet slapped against cold stone as she rounded the corner near the servants' hallway, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, praying with everything she had that the sound was not coming from where she feared it was coming from. It was. She skidded to a stop at the low garden wall and stared in horror at what she saw on the other side. A massive gray wolf, twice the size of any natural animal, was tearing through the neat rows of silver leaf and duskroot she had spent 5 careful years growing. Splintered stems flew into the morning air. Roots that had taken seasons to establish were ripped from the earth in a matter of seconds. The scent of crushed herbs rose thick and bitter, mixing with something hotter and sharper, the unmistakable smell of a wolf, caught in the grip of pure, uncontrolled rage. Lyra pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, not daring to make a single sound, though every instinct in her screamed at her to run forward and try to save what little remained. Those herbs were not simple plants to her. They were the only thing standing between her and a death she had spent her entire life trying to avoid. For 5 years, Lyra had lived within the walls of King Draven Wolf's palace, disguised as nothing more than a quiet, forgettable servant. She refilled water pitchers. She folded linens. She kept her eyes lowered, and her voice soft, and she made absolutely certain that no one, not a single soul within these walls, ever had reason to look at her twice. That invisibility had been the entire foundation of her survival. Every single morning, long before the sun rose high enough to wake the rest of the palace, she ground a careful mixture of silverleaf, duskroot, and 3 other rare herbs into a fine paste, and she rubbed that paste along her wrists, behind her ears, and across her collarbone. The paste erased her natural scent completely, and replaced it with something plain and forgettable, something that smelled like nothing worth noticing at all. Because Lyra Ashwood was an Omega, and in the kingdom of Ashenmoor, Omegas were never simply people. They were prizes. They were weaknesses to be exploited. They were treasures to be captured, claimed, sold, and fought over by alphas who cared far more about the power an Omega's bond could bring them than they ever cared about the person standing beneath that rare and dangerous scent. An unclaimed Omega discovered walking freely through a royal court was rarer than any gem in the treasury, and being that rare made her exactly the kind of prize that powerful men killed each other over without a second thought. She had learned that lesson long before she was old enough to fully understand its weight. She had been 7 years old when raiders from a rival alpha bloodline descended on her village in the black hours of night, hunting specifically for Omegas they could capture and sell to the highest bidder. Her mother had shoved her into the narrow hollow space beneath the kitchen floorboards and pressed a single, desperate command into her ear. Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, do not make a single sound. Lyra had obeyed. She had lain curled in that cramped darkness and listened to everything that happened above her. The screaming, the furniture breaking, and then, far worse than any of it, the silence that followed and never seemed to end. She stayed hidden beneath those floorboards for 2 full days before a traveling healer, drawn by the wreckage of the village, finally found her, half-starved, shaking, and unable to speak above the faintest whisper. That healer had been the one to teach her, patiently and carefully over the following years, the exact combination of scent-masking herbs and the precise way to prepare them, so the disguise would hold even against an alpha's sharpened senses. Lyra had memorized every measurement, every ratio, every small trick that made the difference between a disguise that worked and one that failed. When she was old enough to leave the healer's modest cottage and find her own way in the world, she had chosen the last place anyone would think to look for a hidden Omega. The royal palace itself, hiding in plain sight among hundreds of servants who never bothered to wonder what secrets a quiet handmaiden might be carrying. She had planted her garden in a forgotten corner of the grounds, tucked behind an old stone wall that the palace groundskeepers had long since stopped bothering to inspect. It had kept her safe and unnoticed for 5 entire years. And now, in the space of a single terrible morning, it was gone. The wolf reared back on its hind legs and threw its massive head toward the lightening sky, releasing a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a roar, something raw and furious that seemed to shake the very stones of the courtyard. Something had enraged him far beyond anything reasonable. Lyra had heard whispers among the other servants for the better part of a week, all of them careful and low-voiced, all of them clearly nervous about repeating what they had seen. The king had been behaving strangely, pacing the corridors long after midnight, snapping at advisors who had served him loyally for decades without ever once raising his voice before. Something had gotten under King Draven Wolf's skin, and not a single person in the palace could say what it was. Lyra had assumed it was politics. Rumors of unrest along the northern border, perhaps, or friction with one of the noble houses that so often tested the patience of a young ruler. She had never once imagined, not for a single heartbeat, that the disturbance eating away at the Alpha King's composure might actually be her. The wolf's head swung suddenly in her direction, and Lyra's entire body went rigid with fear. His eyes found her over the broken wall, two burning points of molten gold catching the pale morning light. For one unbearable endless second, neither of them moved. She could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, could feel the cold stone beneath her palms where she gripped the low wall, could smell the wreckage of her garden drifting toward her on the morning breeze. Then he blinked, and something in his posture shifted, and the massive wolf shrank and folded in on itself in a blur of motion, until King Draven Wolf stood where the beast had been only a moment before, bare-chested and breathing hard, his dark hair damp with sweat, his powerful shoulders rising and falling with the effort of whatever battle had just raged inside him. He looked down at the destruction scattered around his bare feet, as though seeing it clearly for the very first time. Torn roots, broken stems, the unmistakable wreckage of a garden that had taken years of patient, careful work to build. Lyra did not wait to discover what he might do next. She turned and fled. She did not get far. Her sandals slipped against the dew-slick stones of the courtyard, and by the time she managed to catch her balance against a low pillar, her entire body had already begun to betray her in a way she recognized with rising, sickening dread. The paste she had applied to her skin the previous evening had worn thin overnight, as it always did by morning, and she had planned to return to her garden and reapply a fresh layer the very moment she finished her early chores. There was no garden left to return to. No fresh herbs to grind, no protection left to renew. Her true scent began to rise from her skin, like smoke curling off a dying fire, faint at first, then growing steadily stronger, sweeter, and unmistakably, undeniably, Omega. She felt it happening beneath her own skin, and could do absolutely nothing to stop it. Panic closed tight around her throat like a fist. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Not running, walking, slow and deliberate, drawing steadily closer with every passing second. She did not turn to look. She told herself that if she simply kept moving, kept her head down, kept walking toward the servants' quarters as though this were any other ordinary morning, somehow this entire nightmare would resolve itself. She would find new herbs somewhere. She would rebuild what had been lost, plant by careful plant. She had survived far worse than this in her short lifetime, and she would survive this too. Wait. The king's voice was quiet, but it cut across the empty courtyard like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Lyra's feet stopped moving before her mind had even finished processing the command. She had served within this palace for 5 full years, and in all that time, she had spoken to King Draven Wolf exactly never. He was a distant figure, glimpsed only from a careful distance, seated upon his throne during formal court, striding through the great hall surrounded always by guards and advisors, his handsome features carved from something that looked very much like stone. He was said to be the strongest alpha to sit upon Ashenmoor's throne in 3 generations, a king who had taken command at only 22 years old, following his father's sudden and still somewhat mysterious death, and who had ruled ever since with an iron will that few dared to challenge openly. He had never taken a mate in all the years since. Rumors whispered among the staff claimed he never intended to. Lyra turned slowly, keeping her eyes fixed carefully on the stone ground beneath her feet, the way she had trained herself to do for 5 long years. It was a habit built entirely around survival, a way of making herself smaller, quieter, less worth a second glance. But she could feel his gaze settling over her, like heat pressed directly against bare skin, and she understood, with a certainty that turned her blood to ice water, that keeping her eyes lowered would not save her this time. "Look at me," he said. She lifted her eyes. King Draven Wolf stood 10 paces away, still bare-chested, still breathing, as though he had run a great distance, though in truth, he had not moved beyond that ruined garden at all. His eyes, that same burning gold she had witnessed in his wolf form only moments earlier, were fixed on her now, with an intensity so complete, it made her want to turn and run again, though some instinct buried far deeper than fear kept her rooted firmly where she stood. He took a step closer, then another, and another, closing the distance between them with unhurried, deliberate purpose. Lyra's pulse hammered so loudly in her own ears that she felt certain he must be able to hear it as clearly as she could. "That scent," he said, his voice low, rough, almost disbelieving, as though he could scarcely trust his own senses. "I have been chasing that exact scent through every corridor of this palace for an entire week. I genuinely believed I was losing my mind." He stopped an arm's length away from her, close enough now that she could see the raw confusion warring openly with something else entirely in his expression, something she had no name for yet. "It's you. It has been you. This entire time." Lyra said nothing at all. There was nothing she could possibly say that would not condemn her further in this moment. "You're an Omega," he said, and it was not phrased as a question. The words hung suspended in the cold morning air between them, heavy and undeniable. Lyra felt the entire world tilt sharply beneath her feet. 5 years of careful, quiet, deliberate survival, undone completely by a single sentence spoken by the one man in this entire kingdom who held the absolute power to destroy her. She thought, briefly and desperately, about running. She thought of the low outer wall near the kitchens, the narrow gap in the stonework just wide enough for a slender person to slip through unnoticed, the one she had marked years ago as her final escape route should this exact nightmare ever come to pass. She thought of the open road beyond the palace grounds, of the deep forests stretching north, of the very real possibility of vanishing completely, the way she had once vanished into a dark hollow beneath a kitchen floor. But before she could force her legs into motion, Draven's hand closed gently around her wrist. Not hard, not cruel in the slightest, just firm enough to hold her steady in place, as though some quiet part of him feared that if he released his grip even for a moment, she might disappear entirely, and he would spend the rest of his life chasing a scent that no longer existed anywhere in the world. "Please," he said, and the single word seemed to cost him something significant, as though it were not a word he found himself using often. "Don't run from me. I only want to understand what I'm looking at." Lyra stared up at him, this king who held the fate of an entire kingdom balanced in his 2 hands, and searched his face desperately for the cruelty she had spent her whole life expecting to find in exactly this kind of moment. She had braced herself for anger, for cold triumph, for the satisfied expression of a predator who had finally, after so much effort, cornered his prey. Instead, what she found in his golden eyes looked far closer to desperation than triumph. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice barely rising above a whisper, "I can explain everything, if you'll allow me." "Then explain," he said, glancing swiftly toward the palace windows rising above them, toward the first stirrings of guards along the outer walls, as the sun climbed steadily higher. "But not here, in the open, where anyone might see us. If another soul catches that scent before I have the chance to properly protect you, there will be nothing left that I can do to help you. Do you understand what I am telling you?" She did understand, completely and immediately. An unclaimed Omega discovered inside palace walls would be seized without delay by the royal council before nightfall even arrived, her entire fate decided by men who viewed her as nothing more than property, rather than a living, breathing person, with a history and a will of her own. Whatever strange, sudden protection this king seemed to be offering her, however impossible it seemed, only minutes after he had personally destroyed the very thing that once kept her safe, might be the only barrier standing between her and a life she had spent 5 long years desperately trying to avoid. "Come with me," Draven said, releasing her wrist at last, though he remained close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed against hers as they began to walk. "Now, quickly, before the palace fully wakes." Lyra cast one final look back at the ruined garden behind the crumbling stone wall, at the crushed and scattered herbs that had protected her identity for 5 entire years, and felt something deep inside her chest crack wide open. There was no path back to the life she had so carefully built for herself. That life had ended the very moment his wolf tore through those fragile, irreplaceable plants. Whatever waited for her now, she understood she would have to face it as herself, fully and completely, for the very first time in longer than she could clearly remember. She followed the king through a narrow side door she had never once been permitted to use during her 5 years of quiet service, down a shadowed corridor still lit by torches that had not yet been extinguished from the previous night, her bare feet moving silently against the cold stone floor, her heart still pounding with a fear that had not yet found its proper name, because it was no longer simply fear of discovery. It was something closer to fear of what discovery might actually mean for the rest of her life. The corridor twisted deeper into the oldest section of the palace, past long-forgotten storage rooms and disused chambers that smelled faintly of dust and aging stone. Lyra kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself as they walked, though the morning air was not particularly cold. It was fear alone that made her shiver, fear and the overwhelming weight of everything that had happened in such a short span of time. "Where exactly are you taking me?" She finally dared to ask, when the silence stretching between them grew too heavy for her to bear any longer. "My private study," Draven answered without slowing his purposeful stride. "No one enters that room without my direct permission. Not my advisors, not my guards. Not even my own mother, when she visited during the final years of her life." He glanced briefly back at her, and for just a moment his stern expression softened into something almost apologetic. "You will be safe there, at least until we can decide together what happens next." "We," he had said, as though her entire fate had suddenly become something they would determine together, rather than something decided coldly for her by men in council chambers who had never once bothered to learn her actual name. They reached a heavy wooden door at the very end of the winding corridor, carved deeply with the royal crest of a snarling wolf beneath a crown. Draven pressed his palm firmly against a hidden mechanism built into the doorframe, and the door swung open with a soft, well-oiled click. Inside, the study was warm and quiet, lined from floor to ceiling with tall bookshelves and lit by narrow windows that looked out over the distant eastern hills. A fire had already been carefully laid within the hearth, though it had not yet been lit that morning. Draven ushered her inside quickly and shut the heavy door firmly behind them, and for the very first time since that terrible scream had woken her from sleep, Lyra finally allowed herself the luxury of breathing freely. "Sit," Draven said gently, gesturing toward a large chair positioned near the cold fireplace. "Please, sit down." She sat, though every instinct urged her to remain standing, to stay alert and ready to run should this sudden, unexpected kindness reveal itself to be nothing more than the deceptive calm before an entirely different kind of storm. Draven crossed the room to the hearth and knelt down to light the fire with his own 2 hands, waving away the servants who would normally have performed such a small task for him without a second thought. Lyra watched his hands work steadily and surely, and tried desperately to reconcile this quiet, careful, thoughtful man kneeling before her with the wild, uncontrolled creature that had torn through her garden less than an hour earlier. "I owe you a proper explanation," he said, once the flames had finally caught and begun spreading their gentle warmth throughout the room. He rose to his feet and turned to face her directly, leaning back against the mantel, with his arms crossed loosely over his bare chest. Someone had quietly delivered a fresh shirt to him at some point during their walk through the palace, though Lyra had not noticed exactly when that exchange had taken place. "My wolf has been restless for an entire week now, pacing, hunting for something I could not name or explain to myself. I genuinely believed perhaps I was falling ill, or that some hidden threat had entered these palace walls that my deeper instincts recognized long before my conscious mind ever caught up." He shook his head slowly, clearly still working through the shock of it himself. "I never once imagined that the threat my wolf had been sensing so desperately was actually the very person he has been searching for his entire existence." Lyra's breath caught sharply in her throat. She understood exactly what he was describing, even though she had never once expected to hear those particular words spoken directly toward her. The mate bond, that ancient, unbreakable pull said to exist between an alpha and the single soul in all the world, meant to stand permanently beside him. "You believe I am your fated mate," she said carefully, testing each word before allowing it to leave her lips. "I know it," Draven said, and there was not the slightest hesitation anywhere in his voice. The moment I saw you standing in that courtyard, everything inside me recognized you instantly and completely. 5 years, and I never once knew you were here, hiding quietly within my own palace walls." He studied her closely with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something stubborn kept her eyes locked firmly on his. "Why hide for so long, Lyra? You could have claimed my protection on the very first day you ever set foot inside these walls." Lyra's hands tightened into fists in her lap, because protection offered by an alpha is never the same thing as genuine safety, she said quietly. "I learned that particular lesson long before I was old enough to fully understand its true meaning. My own mother believed the same comforting lie once. It cost her absolutely everything she had." Something shifted behind Draven's eyes, a flicker of quiet understanding, perhaps even a flash of recognition for pain, that mirrored something buried deep in his own past. But before he could press her to explain further, a sharp, urgent knock sounded against the heavy study door, and both of them went instantly, completely still. "Your Majesty," came a formal, clipped voice from somewhere out in the hallway. "The Council has urgently requested your immediate presence. There are troubling reports of an unfamiliar scent detected within the palace grounds this morning. Several guards claim to have identified an unregistered Omega moving through these very halls." Lyra's heart stopped beating entirely for one long, terrifying second. Draven's eyes met hers across the quiet room, gold and unshakably steady, and in that single shared look, Lyra understood with sudden clarity that whatever fragile safety she had briefly believed herself to have found within this warm, private study was about to be tested in ways that neither of them could yet fully predict or control. "Give me one moment," Draven called back through the door, his voice betraying absolutely none of the tension Lyra could see written plainly across every line of his tightening body. He crossed the room quickly and knelt directly in front of her chair, lowering his voice until it fell to barely above a whisper. "Listen carefully to me. Whatever happens next, out there, do not speak, unless I specifically tell you that it is safe to do so. Do not run from me, no matter how frightened you become. Trust me, and I give you my solemn word, I will not allow them to take you from this room." Lyra searched his face one final time, searching desperately for any hint of deception, any small sign that his solemn promise might be entirely hollow beneath its confident surface. She found none whatsoever, only fierce, unwavering resolve, the kind of steady determination she had not seen directed toward her by anyone in longer than she could remember. "All right," she whispered back, her voice trembling only slightly. "I trust you. For now." Draven rose to his feet, straightened his broad shoulders, and turned to face the heavy study door, ready now to confront the council that was about to demand answers. He was not yet entirely certain how to give them. Behind him, Lyra remained seated close beside the growing fire, her heart still pounding wildly, her true scent still rising faintly and unmistakably from her bare skin, with absolutely nothing left in the world to hide it, and the terrifying, undeniable knowledge that her old, carefully hidden life was now gone, forever settling slowly over her like a heavy shroud. Whatever waited for her on the other side of that heavy wooden door, she understood clearly now. There was no going back to who she used to be. The council chamber was already full by the time Draven strode inside, his boots striking hard against the polished marble floor, in a sharp, deliberate rhythm that echoed off the high stone walls. 6 senior advisors sat gathered around the long table, and 2 of the palace's most senior guards stood at rigid attention near the far wall, their expressions carefully blank. Every single eye in the chamber turned toward him the moment he entered. "Your Majesty," said Lord Halden, the eldest member of the council, and a man who had faithfully served Draven's father for decades before ever serving Draven himself. His weathered face was creased with what appeared to be genuine concern, though Draven could not immediately tell whether that concern sprang from true worry for the kingdom or simple, careful political caution. "Forgive this early interruption, Your Majesty, but the matter could not reasonably wait until later in the day. Guards stationed along the eastern wall report an unfamiliar scent moving through the palace grounds sometime before dawn broke. Unregistered, unclaimed. The scent signature itself is unmistakably that of an Omega. And you genuinely believe this warrants pulling me directly from my private mourning?" Draven asked, keeping his voice level and controlled, betraying nothing whatsoever of the storm still building steadily beneath his calm exterior. "An unclaimed Omega discovered within these palace walls represents a serious breach of security, Your Majesty, said another advisor, a sharp-featured woman named Beatrice Calloway, who oversaw all matters relating to palace defense and had served on the council for nearly a decade. If word ever reaches a rival house that an unregistered Omega has been living quietly among your own staff for any significant length of time, it will inevitably raise troubling questions about how such a person entered these walls undetected in the first place, and how long precisely they may have remained hidden without notice. Such a discovery could easily be perceived as a serious weakness in Your Majesty's rule, or, far worse, it could be interpreted as evidence of deliberate infiltration. Draven's jaw tightened noticeably at the word infiltration, though he worked carefully to keep his outward expression perfectly neutral. He had known, from the very moment the guard's knock sounded against his study door, that this exact conversation was coming. But hearing his own people spoken about so coldly, framed as a potential spy, a weapon deliberately planted against his throne, ignited something fiercely protective in his chest that startled him with the sheer intensity of its arrival. "Have you managed to locate this Omega?" he asked, his voice carefully even. "Not as of yet, Your Majesty," Lord Halden admitted. "The scent trail our trackers followed led toward the eastern garden and then scattered somewhere near your private study. Understandably, none of the guards felt it appropriate to search further without receiving Your Majesty's direct permission first." Draven felt the full weight of every eye in that chamber settling firmly upon him, waiting, watching closely for any small reaction that might reveal more than he intended to give away. He thought immediately of Lyra sitting quietly beside his fire at that very moment, her scent still marking her clearly as exactly what this entire council feared most. One careless word here, one small admission spoken too freely, and every advisor in this chamber would descend upon his study within a matter of minutes. "I will handle this particular matter personally," Draven said, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of a direct royal command, rather than any kind of polite suggestion. "Whoever this Omega turns out to be, they now stand under my direct personal protection, and fall entirely under my own authority. No further search of these grounds is required from this point forward." A heavy silence settled across the entire chamber. Lord Halden exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with Beatrice Calloway, and Draven could see plainly the unspoken question forming behind both their watchful eyes. "Your Majesty," Halden said carefully, choosing his next words with evident caution. "With the greatest respect, if you have already located this individual, the full council should surely be informed of their identity, purely for the continued security of both the palace and the wider kingdom." "The council will be informed of precisely what I choose to tell them, when I choose to tell it," Draven said, and though his tone remained perfectly even throughout, there was unmistakable steel woven beneath every single word he spoke. "I am king of this land. This palace, and everyone residing within it, falls squarely under my own judgment, not beneath the council's collective judgment. Does anyone in this chamber require a reminder of that particular fact?" No one answered him. No one present dared to. "Very well, Your Majesty," Halden said at last, inclining his head respectfully, though his sharp eyes remained clouded with unspoken suspicion. "The council trusts entirely in your judgment, as we always have." Draven did not miss the careful, guarded edge lurking beneath those particular words. The way the word trust had been spoken, almost like a hollow formality, rather than any kind of genuine truth. He understood, even as he turned to leave the chamber behind him, that this matter was far from finished. Beatrice Calloway in particular had never once been an advisor easily satisfied by vague royal decree alone, and he suspected strongly that she would continue searching quietly for answers, regardless of whether he granted his permission or not. He made his way back toward his private study, to find Lyra exactly where he had left her, though she had risen from her chair, and now stood near the tall window, watching the courtyard below with an expression of quiet, carefully controlled fear. She turned quickly the moment the door opened, searching his face desperately for any hint of news. "They have not found you," Draven said, closing the heavy door firmly behind him. "For now, at least, you remain safe. I have claimed you formally under my personal protection." Relief flickered briefly across her delicate features, followed almost immediately by a familiar wariness that Draven was already beginning to recognize as simply an essential part of who she was. A deep caution, built carefully from years spent learning that safety could vanish completely in the span of a single unguarded instant. "Your protection," she repeated slowly, testing the phrase carefully. What exactly does that mean, Your Majesty? What actually happens to me now? It was a perfectly fair question, and one Draven realized, somewhat uncomfortably, that he did not yet have a complete answer for. Everything about this entire situation had unfolded far faster than he had time to properly think through its many consequences. He had acted purely on instinct back in that courtyard, and again inside the council chamber, driven entirely by a bond he barely understood himself and could not yet fully explain, even to his own satisfaction. It means that no one may touch you without my direct consent, Draven said. It means the council cannot seize you, cannot question you, cannot decide your fate without first going through me. It is the strongest form of protection I am able to offer you within the established laws of this kingdom. And beyond the laws? Lyra asked quietly, her eyes searching his. What do you actually want from me, Your Majesty? Beyond simple protection? The question hung suspended in the air between them, honest in a way that very few people within these palace walls ever dared to be with him. Draven crossed the room slowly toward her, stopping at a respectful distance, though every instinct in his body urged him to close that remaining gap entirely. I want to understand you, he said. I want to know why a woman who might well be my fated mate chose to spend 5 entire years hiding within my own palace, rather than trusting me with the simple truth of who she was. I want to know your proper name, not merely the name written on some forgotten servant's roster somewhere. He paused, watching her carefully. And I want you to understand that whatever happens next, I will never force anything upon you that you do not freely choose for yourself. Lyra studied him closely for a long, silent moment, weighing the truth she heard in his words against every painful lesson she had ever learned about alphas and their promises. I have not yet decided how much I trust you, she said honestly. Your Majesty, I have spent 5 years surviving because I trusted no one at all with the truth of what I truly am. That deeply ingrained instinct does not simply vanish because you happen to speak a few kind words and offer me a warm room to sit in. Fair enough, Draven said, and to her genuine surprise, there was no offense whatsoever detectable in his tone, only a quiet, patient acceptance that seemed entirely sincere. Then allow me the chance to earn it properly, slowly, if that is what it takes. Before Lyra could offer any response, a soft, hesitant knock sounded against the study door, far gentler than the guard's earlier interruption had been. Draven crossed quickly to answer it, opening the heavy door just enough to reveal a young woman standing anxiously in the corridor beyond, dressed in the simple gray uniform worn by palace staff, her wide eyes betraying barely contained urgency. Your Majesty, she said quickly, glancing nervously past him into the room. Please forgive my intrusion, but I need to speak with you at once. It concerns the garden. Draven's brow furrowed with confusion. What exactly about the garden? The young woman hesitated visibly, her gaze flicking briefly toward Lyra before returning to settle on the king. I have served within this palace for 3 full years now, Your Majesty. I know very well that garden belongs to her. She nodded slightly in Lyra's direction. I have watched her tending it quietly before dawn, more times than I could possibly count. I never once told anyone what I saw, because I understood clearly what those particular herbs truly meant. I understood exactly what she was working so hard to protect. Lyra's breath caught sharply, a fresh wave of genuine fear rising, as she realized her carefully guarded secret had never been quite as hidden as she had always believed it to be. Your name? Draven asked carefully, studying the young woman closely. Grace, Your Majesty. Grace Whitmore. I work down in the kitchens. She twisted her hands together nervously as she spoke. I am not here to cause any trouble, Your Majesty. I came because I happened to overhear 2 guards speaking together in the corridor, just a few moments ago. They mentioned that Lady Calloway is planning to search the Eastern Garden herself, Your Majesty, entirely regardless of your direct orders. She apparently believes you are hiding something significant from the council, and she intends to find solid proof of it. Draven's expression darkened considerably. When, exactly, does she intend to search? Within the hour, Your Majesty. Or so the guards claimed. I came here as quickly as I possibly could. Draven turned immediately to look at Lyra, and she could clearly see the rapid calculations already forming behind his golden eyes, the heavy weight of a king who understood all too well that protecting one single person now meant carefully navigating an entire court full of suspicion and constant political maneuvering. If Calloway searches that garden and discovers clear evidence of what once grew there, he said slowly, evidence of scent-masking herbs, deliberately cultivated in secret, it will not matter in the slightest that I have already claimed you under my personal protection. She will use that discovery as solid proof of deliberate deception, proof that you infiltrated this palace with clear intent, and she will suddenly hold legitimate grounds to challenge my entire authority over this whole matter. Then what do we do? Lyra asked, her earlier careful composure giving way rapidly to genuine, rising alarm. We reach that garden before she does, Draven said, already moving briskly toward the door. He turned back briefly to Grace. Thank you sincerely for this warning. You have my full gratitude and my complete discretion. No one will ever learn that you came to me. Grace nodded quickly and slipped away down the shadowed corridor, leaving Draven and Lyra alone together once more. He held out his open hand toward her, an unspoken offer rather than any kind of command. Come with me, he said gently. If Calloway is truly determined to search that garden, we must make absolutely certain there is nothing at all left for her to find. Lyra looked down at his outstretched hand for a long moment, at this king who had upended her entire carefully constructed world within the span of a single morning, and was now offering to help her salvage what little remained of it. She thought briefly of her mother, of the hidden floorboards, of every hard lesson that had ever taught her never to place her own safety directly into an alpha's waiting hands. Then she thought of Grace Whitmore, a near stranger, who had faithfully kept her secret for years without ever once being asked to do so, and of Draven, standing firmly before his entire council, only moments earlier, refusing outright to hand her over, despite every mounting political pressure, urging him to do exactly that. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her hand in his. Let's hurry then, she said quietly. Together, they moved swiftly through the winding palace corridors, retracing the exact path Lyra had run along, in terror only hours earlier, though this time, she was not running away from the king walking beside her. She was running alongside him now, toward whatever uncertain future awaited them both, bound together suddenly by a bond neither of them had ever chosen for themselves, yet neither of them could honestly deny. Behind them, hidden carefully in the shadows of a side corridor, Beatrice Calloway watched the two of them pass by with narrowed, calculating eyes, already forming the first quiet outlines of a plan that would soon test every single promise Draven had made that morning to protect her. The eastern garden looked far worse in the full light of morning than it had appeared during the gray hush of dawn. Broken stems lay scattered haphazardly across churned earth, and the low stone wall that had hidden this small patch of ground for 5 careful years now stood, partially crumbled, offering an unobstructed view to absolutely anyone who cared to glance in that direction. Lyra's stomach twisted painfully at the sight of it. This modest garden had been the one place within the entire palace that belonged only to her, and now it lay exposed like an open, aching wound for the whole world to see. There, Draven said quickly, pointing toward a small cluster of stone pots positioned near the collapsed section of wall, mostly untouched by the surrounding destruction. Are those the herbs you need? Some of them, Lyra said, already moving forward and dropping quickly to her knees beside the pots. Silverleaf, duskroot. If Lady Calloway finds these particular plants still intact, she will know immediately exactly what they are, and exactly what purpose they were used for. Then we take them with us, Draven said, kneeling down beside her without a moment's hesitation, his hands already reaching for the nearest pot. You are the king, Lyra said, genuinely startled. You should not be digging through dirt like a common gardener, Your Majesty. I destroyed your garden with my own hands, Draven said simply, not looking up from his work. The very least I can do now is help you save whatever remains of it. There was something quietly sincere in his tone that stopped her protest before it could fully form on her lips, a genuine sincerity that did not match at all the cold, distant reputation she had carefully built up in her mind over 5 long years of watching him only from a careful, safe distance. They worked together quickly, gathering the surviving plants into a cloth sack Draven produced from somewhere beneath his cloak, uprooting anything at all that might reveal her closely guarded secret to a searching eye. The morning sun climbed steadily higher above the distant hills, and with every passing minute, Lyra's frayed nerves stretched tighter and tighter, certain that Beatrice Calloway would appear at any moment now. Faster. Please, she urged, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. We do not have very much time left. We are nearly finished, Draven said, though his own movements had visibly quickened as well. He glanced repeatedly toward the garden's narrow entrance, his sharpened senses straining for any sign of approach. Once this area is fully cleared, there will be absolutely nothing left behind to prove what once grew here. They had very nearly emptied the last remaining pot when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed sharply from the garden entrance, deliberate and unhurried against the stone path. Lyra froze completely, her heart lurching painfully into her throat. Draven rose smoothly to his feet, positioning himself slightly in front of her, without seeming to consciously think about it at all, an instinct as entirely natural to him now as simply breathing. Beatrice Calloway stepped into the garden, flanked closely by 2 armed guards, her sharp eyes taking in the entire scene before her with a cold, calculating precision that made Lyra's skin crawl uncomfortably. Her gaze traveled slowly from the destroyed garden itself, to the cloth sack held tightly in Draven's hand, to Lyra kneeling quietly in the dirt behind him, and something resembling grim satisfaction settled slowly over her sharp features. Your Majesty, she said, her voice carrying a careful, deliberately formal politeness that did absolutely nothing to disguise the suspicion simmering visibly beneath it. I did not expect to find you here so early this morning. Tending a garden, of all things. Lady Calloway, Draven replied, his tone giving away absolutely nothing. I was not aware that my own private activities required an audience of any kind. Of course not, Your Majesty. Calloway's eyes flicked briefly toward Lyra once again, lingering there just long enough to make her underlying threat perfectly clear. Though I confess, I do find myself genuinely curious. This particular garden appears to have been quite recently disturbed. And the young woman kneeling beside you carries a scent I do not recognize whatsoever from our palace registry. This young woman now stands under my direct protection, Draven said, his voice hardening noticeably. As I already informed the full council earlier this very morning, I do not believe I owe anyone further explanation beyond that. No, Your Majesty, you certainly do not owe the council anything at all, Calloway said smoothly. But you may soon discover that certain questions cannot simply be silenced through royal decree alone. There exist laws within this kingdom specifically regarding unregistered omegas, laws designed to protect the throne itself from infiltration and manipulation. I would genuinely hate to see Your Majesty's careful judgment clouded by matters that are, perhaps, rather more personal in nature than they first appear to be. The implication hung heavily in the still morning air, an accusation dressed carefully in respectful language, yet an accusation nonetheless. Lyra felt hot color rise in her cheeks, a mixture of fear and rising anger she had rarely allowed herself to feel toward anyone standing so far above her own humble station. Careful, Lady Calloway, Draven said, his voice dropping into something low and genuinely dangerous that Lyra had not yet heard emerge from him. You forget yourself entirely. Questioning my personal judgment is one matter. Suggesting outright that I have somehow been manipulated is quite another matter altogether, and I would strongly advise you never to repeat that particular suggestion again. Calloway's composed expression did not visibly break, though something behind her eyes tightened noticeably. Forgive me, Your Majesty. I only wish to protect this kingdom, exactly as I have always faithfully done. Then trust that I am doing precisely the same thing, Draven said firmly. This particular matter is now closed. Should I require the council's input on anything further, I will provide it in my own time. For a long, tense moment, Calloway simply studied him in silence, and Lyra had the deeply unsettling sense that this sharp, calculating woman was already recalculating, quietly adjusting her strategy in real time rather than genuinely backing down from her position. Finally, she inclined her head in a shallow, formal bow. As you wish, Your Majesty, she said. I shall leave you to your gardening then. Her cool eyes moved once more toward Lyra, assessing and unreadable. Miss Ashwood, Draven answered smoothly, before Lyra could speak for herself. Lyra Ashwood. Miss Ashwood, Calloway repeated slowly, as though carefully committing the name to memory for reasons entirely her own. Welcome to the palace's inner circle then. I am quite certain you will find it a most interesting place to live from now on. With that, she turned sharply and departed, her 2 guards falling into formation behind her. leaving the garden settling into a silence that felt considerably heavier than before her arrival. Lyra let out a long breath she had not even realized she was holding, her hands still trembling faintly where they rested against the disturbed earth beneath her. "She knows," Lyra whispered. "She may not yet hold solid proof, but she absolutely knows the truth." "Perhaps she does," Draven admitted, watching the now empty garden entrance with a visibly troubled expression. "Beatrice Calloway has faithfully served 3 full generations of my family. She is intelligent, deeply ambitious, and rarely ever wrong about the things she chooses to suspect. This will certainly not be the last time she tests the 2 of us together." "Us," Lyra repeated softly, quietly testing the small word the way he had earlier tested her own name. Draven turned back to face her fully, offering his hand once again to help her rise from the disturbed dirt beneath them. "Yes," he said simply. "Us, together. Whatever happens from this point forward, you are no longer facing any of it alone. I made that solemn promise to you this very morning, and I fully intend to keep it, no matter what comes." Lyra accepted his offered hand, allowing him to pull her gently upright, and for one brief, quiet moment, they stood close together, amid the scattered ruins of the garden that had once served as her only true sanctuary. She studied his face carefully, searching once more for any lingering hint of the cold, distant king she had watched from a careful distance for 5 long years, and found instead someone far more complicated, far more uncertain, and far more genuinely determined than she had ever once imagined possible. "Why does any of this matter so much to you?" she asked quietly. "I understand the pull of the mate bond. I understand exactly what your wolf recognizes so strongly in me. But you could easily have handed me over to the council this very morning and been entirely done with the complication I represent. Why choose to fight for me instead?" Draven remained quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting slowly toward the distant hills beyond the ruined garden wall, as though searching carefully for the right words somewhere out in that far landscape. "6 years ago now," he said finally, "before I ever took this throne, I genuinely believed I had found someone who truly understood me, someone existing entirely outside the constant pressures of politics and royal duty. I trusted her completely, without reservation. It turned out, in the end, that she had been working secretly for a rival house this entire time, quietly gathering information, intended to weaken my father's rule, before I ever wore this crown myself." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly at the old memory. "When the full truth finally came out, I swore to myself that I would never again allow myself to trust anyone so blindly. I built careful walls around everything that truly mattered to me, and I told myself that such walls were simply the necessary price of being king." "And now?" Lyra asked softly, watching him closely. "Now my own wolf has spent 5 entire years living quietly, alongside a woman who never once attempted to use her hidden position for any personal advantage, who chose to hide herself away, rather than seek power through deception, who deliberately chose quiet survival through inner strength, rather than manipulation of any kind." Draven met her eyes directly, and held her gaze steadily. "You could have told me exactly who you truly were, on the very first day you ever arrived within this palace, Lyra. Many people in your position would have used that particular knowledge to claim immediate protection, status, or influence for themselves. You chose silence instead, for 5 long, difficult years, asking absolutely nothing of me in return. That tells me far more about your true character than any spoken words ever possibly could." Lyra felt something shift deep inside her chest, a carefully constructed wall she had built up just as deliberately as his own beginning, to slowly crack beneath the honest weight of his words. "I did not hide myself because I doubted your particular character," she admitted quietly. "I hid because I doubted the wider world surrounding you, the council, the harsh laws, the powerful men who see Omegas as nothing more than prizes rather than genuine people. That deep-seated fear does not simply vanish overnight because you happen to show me kindness during one single morning." "I understand completely," Draven said gently, "and I will never ask you to trust the wider world around me overnight. But perhaps, given enough time, you might slowly learn to trust me personally." Before Lyra could offer any response, a sudden gust of wind swept abruptly through the garden, scattering loose petals and dried leaves across the broken stones beneath their feet, and somewhere far beyond the palace walls, a distant horn sounded out, low and unmistakably urgent, the exact kind of signal traditionally reserved for approaching visitors of significant importance. Draven's head turned sharply toward the distant sound, his expression shifting immediately from quiet vulnerability back into the composed, watchful authority of a king on full alert. "That particular horn," he said, "belongs to the royal guard permanently stationed at the northern gate. It signals an arrival from somewhere outside the kingdom's own borders." He frowned deeply, clearly troubled by the timing. "We were not expecting any visitors today." "Who exactly would arrive completely unannounced like this?" Lyra asked, unease creeping steadily back into her voice. "I honestly do not know," Draven admitted, "but given everything else that has already happened this particular morning, I strongly doubt this is any kind of simple coincidence." He turned back to face her fully, his expression hardening once more with renewed, focused purpose. "Stay close beside me. Whatever this turns out to be, I want you exactly where I can see you at all times." Lyra nodded quickly, following closely as he strode with purpose out of the ruined garden and back toward the main palace, the sack of rescued herbs still clutched tightly in one hand, her heart pounding steadily with a fresh wave of rising uncertainty. The morning had already delivered far more upheaval than she had experienced during 5 entire quiet years of careful hiding, and something deep in her bones told her clearly that this particular day was far from finished testing them both severely. As they crossed the wide courtyard toward the northern gate, Lyra caught sight of Grace Whitmore, watching quietly from a kitchen doorway, her expression tight with visible concern. Standing beside her was another figure Lyra recognized only vaguely, a tall guard named Nathan who had always treated the palace staff with unusually genuine courtesy compared to most of his fellow guards. Both of them exchanged a quick, knowing glance as the king passed by, and Lyra found herself wondering, not for the first time that long morning, exactly how many quiet, careful observers within these very walls had actually been watching her far more closely than she had ever once realized. The horn sounded again, considerably closer now, and beyond the distant northern gate, the steady sound of approaching hooves grew noticeably louder against the packed earth road leading directly into the palace grounds. "Whoever this turns out to be," Draven murmured, speaking more to himself than directly to her, "I have a growing feeling our particular morning is about to become considerably more complicated than it already has been." Lyra said nothing further in response, but she quickened her own pace to match his stride, bracing herself carefully for whatever new challenge now waited just beyond those distant gates, painfully aware that the closely guarded secret she had protected for 5 long years was no longer hers alone to protect anymore. By the time Draven and Lyra reached the northern courtyard, a small procession had already passed through the outer gates. 6 riders dressed in dark green cloaks sat astride tall, well-groomed horses, their banners bearing the striking emblem of a raven clutching a crescent moon, a sigil Lyra recognized instantly, though she had never once expected to see it flying so boldly within the walls of Ashenmoor itself. "House Ravencrest," Draven muttered under his breath, his entire posture shifting immediately into something guarded and rigidly formal. "Lord Edward Ravencrest himself, unless I am very much mistaken, judging by those particular banners." "That name means absolutely nothing to me," Lyra admitted quietly, watching the riders dismount with careful, practiced grace. "It should mean something," Draven replied. "House Ravencrest has coveted this very throne for 3 full generations now. They lost their original claim to my grandfather in a bitter dispute over disputed territory decades ago, and they have never once truly forgotten that loss. My own father spent nearly half his entire reign carefully managing a fragile peace with them. If Edward Ravencrest is riding unannounced directly into my palace today, it is most certainly not a friendly social visit." The lead rider dismounted first, with practiced, unhurried ease, a tall man with sharp, aristocratic features and dark hair, swept neatly back from a face that carried the kind of handsome, easy confidence that comes only from a lifetime of never once being told no. He surveyed the courtyard around him with cool, assessing eyes, before finally settling his gaze directly on Draven, offering a bow that was technically correct in every formal detail, yet carried an unmistakable undertone of quiet mockery. "Your Majesty," Edward Ravencrest said, his voice smooth and pleasant in a way that made Lyra's skin prickle immediately, with instinctive distrust. "Forgive this entirely unannounced arrival. I beg you. Urgent matters do not always allow for proper advance courtesy." "Lord Ravencrest," Draven replied evenly, betraying nothing. It has certainly been quite some time since your last visit. What urgent matter exactly brings you to Ashenmore, without a single word of warning sent ahead? Edward's sharp eyes drifted briefly past Draven, settling for a long moment on Lyra, with an open interest that made her want to retreat quietly into the surrounding shadows, though she forced herself to remain perfectly still, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of watching her flinch away. Rumors travel remarkably quickly between neighboring kingdoms, Your Majesty, he said smoothly, finally returning his full attention to Draven. Rumors of growing unrest within your own council. Rumors of a significant disturbance somewhere in your palace, involving an unregistered Omega. His smile widened slightly, knowingly. I confess, my own curiosity simply got the better of me in the end. I thought perhaps I might offer my genuine assistance, given the rather delicate nature of such sensitive matters. Lyra's blood ran instantly cold. Somehow, impossibly, word of that very morning's events had already traveled well beyond the palace walls, fast enough to reach a rival house before the sun had even fully cleared the eastern horizon. Someone within these very walls was actively talking, sharing secrets, and the sudden realization sent a fresh wave of genuine fear crawling steadily up her spine. Your concern has been duly noted, Draven said, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to cut cleanly through Edward's carefully practiced charm. But Ashenmore requires absolutely no outside assistance managing its own strictly internal affairs. I would, however, be curious to know what particular source provided you with such detailed rumors, given precisely how quickly they must have traveled to reach you. A wise king should never reveal his sources, Your Majesty, Edward said smoothly, clearly enjoying himself immensely. Surely you understand that particular principle better than most rulers alive today. Draven's jaw tightened visibly, though he said nothing further on the matter, clearly unwilling to grant Edward the satisfaction of witnessing any further visible reaction from him. Instead, he gestured firmly toward the palace entrance behind him. If you genuinely wish to discuss matters of diplomacy, Lord Ravencrest, I would strongly prefer we do so within the appropriate formal chamber, rather than standing here in my own courtyard, exchanging idle rumors. Of course, Your Majesty, Edward said, though his gaze lingered on Lyra a moment longer, before he finally turned to follow Draven toward the palace entrance. As he passed close by her, he offered a slight, mocking bow, his voice dropping low enough that only she could clearly hear his words. A genuine pleasure, Miss Ashwood. I do sincerely hope we find the opportunity to speak further before my visit here eventually concludes. Lyra said absolutely nothing in response, but a deep chill settled firmly in her chest as she watched him walk away, that same easy confidence radiating from every unhurried step he took, the quiet certainty of a man who clearly believed he already held some significant advantage that neither she nor Draven yet fully understood. She followed at a careful distance as Draven led Edward and his small retinue toward the formal receiving chamber, her mind racing rapidly through the troubling implications of what she had just personally witnessed. Someone inside this very palace had spoken directly to House Ravencrest, and spoken quickly enough that word had reached them well before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon. Only a small handful of people actually knew the complete truth of what she truly was. The council members present during that morning's session, the guards who had originally reported the strange scent, perhaps Grace, though Lyra genuinely could not imagine her betraying the very secret she had personally risked herself to protect. Or perhaps, Lyra realized slowly, with a growing sense of cold dread, someone had actually been watching her long before this particular morning ever began, patient and quiet, carefully waiting for the perfect moment to finally use what they already knew. Inside the formal receiving chamber, Draven took his seat upon a smaller ceremonial throne, reserved specifically for such formal audiences, while Edward remained standing before him, flanked closely by two of his own personal guards. Lyra positioned herself carefully near the far wall, close enough to hear every word spoken, yet far enough away to remain reasonably inconspicuous, though she doubted anything about this particular morning had left her genuinely inconspicuous any longer. Speak plainly, Lord Ravencrest, Draven said firmly. What exactly is it that you actually want from Ashenmore? Edward's expression shifted subtly into something considerably more serious, the playful mockery from the courtyard, giving way gradually to careful, deliberate calculation. Ashenmore has always carefully maintained a delicate balance of power with House Ravencrest, Your Majesty. A balance built entirely on mutual restraint and mutual respect for boundaries that neither house has dared to cross in 3 full generations. He paused deliberately for effect. But an unclaimed Omega, discovered hiding quietly within a king's own palace for years on end, unregistered and entirely unaccounted for, represents a rather significant irregularity. Other neighboring houses may soon begin to seriously question whether Ashenmoor's own borders remain as genuinely secure as they have always believed them to be. Whether other unregistered individuals might also be moving freely through your lands, entirely unnoticed by anyone. Are you deliberately suggesting that Ashenmoor's security has somehow been compromised? Draven asked, his voice deceptively calm and controlled. I am merely suggesting, Edward said carefully, choosing his words with obvious precision, that perception matters just as much as reality, in delicate matters of diplomacy, Your Majesty. Perhaps it would considerably ease certain lingering concerns if this particular Omega were formally registered under Ashenmoor's official protection, with appropriate documentation shared openly among neighboring houses, simply as a straightforward matter of continued transparency. Lyra understood immediately and completely what he was actually proposing beneath his carefully diplomatic language. Formal registration would mean her full name, her entire history, her very existence recorded permanently and shared openly with rival houses, stripped entirely of the quiet anonymity that had kept her alive and safe for 5 long years. It would effectively place her on open display for any ambitious alpha, bold enough to challenge Draven's claim over her directly. That particular decision belongs entirely to me and to her, Draven said firmly, not to House Ravencrest, and certainly not to any council member eager for gossip, disguised as genuine diplomatic concern. Edward's smile returned slowly, thin and knowing. Of course, Your Majesty. I offer this particular suggestion purely in the spirit of continued peace between our 2 great houses. He glanced briefly toward Lyra once again. Though I confess, given the rather unusual circumstances surrounding her recent discovery, I imagine there will be many within your own council who share my own genuine concerns, whether I choose to voice them aloud or not. The implication was clear enough for anyone present to understand. Edward Ravencrest had not traveled all this way simply to offer genuine assistance. He had traveled here specifically to plant careful seeds of doubt, to deliberately widen whatever existing cracks already ran through Draven's own court, and to remind everyone present, subtly yet unmistakably, that House Ravencrest was watching closely, patiently waiting for any weakness they might eventually exploit to their own advantage. I believe this particular audience has now concluded, Draven said, rising from his throne with an air of quiet finality that left absolutely no room for further discussion. You remain welcome to rest within Ashenmoor's guest quarters before your eventual return journey, Lord Ravencrest. I trust you fully understand that any further discussion of this particular matter with anyone outside this room would be considered a rather significant breach of the mutual respect our 2 houses have carefully maintained for 3 full generations. Edward inclined his head graciously, the very picture of gracious acceptance, though Lyra did not miss the calculating gleam still clearly present in his sharp eyes. Understood completely, Your Majesty. I would never wish to cause any genuine offense. He offered one final formal bow before turning to depart, his small retinue falling into step closely behind him, though as he passed near Lyra by the wall, he paused just long enough to speak once more, his voice pitched too low for Draven to overhear. Whatever protection the king offers you now, Miss Ashwood, Edward murmured quietly, do remember that thrones shift over time, and promises made in the sudden heat of a fresh mate bond do not always survive the colder calculations of politics. Should you ever find yourself in genuine need of a different kind of protection, House Ravencrest would warmly welcome someone possessing your rather unique qualities. Before Lyra could offer any response whatsoever, he was already moving past her, disappearing through the chamber doors, with his guards close behind him, leaving her standing frozen against the wall, his quiet threat echoing uncomfortably in her mind long after he had finally gone. Draven crossed the chamber quickly the moment the doors had closed, his expression tight with barely contained anger. What exactly did he say to you just now? Nothing of any real importance, Lyra said, though her own voice betrayed the lie even as she spoke it aloud. Lyra. Draven's voice softened noticeably, though his eyes remained sharp with genuine concern. Please tell me. If Edward Ravencrest threatened you in any way whatsoever, I need to know about it immediately." She hesitated briefly, then finally relented, repeating Edward's exact words as accurately as she could manage to remember them. Draven's expression darkened further with every single sentence she spoke, his hands curling slowly into tight fists at his sides. "He will not touch you," Draven said, his voice low and genuinely fierce. "I do not care what particular games House Ravencrest wishes to play with us. You remain under my protection, and I fully intend to honor that solemn promise, regardless of whatever politics may come." "He is not entirely wrong about one particular thing," Lyra said quietly. "Promises made in the sudden heat of a mate bond do not always hold firm under real pressure. I have seen enough of this world already to know that much for certain." "Then I will simply have to prove myself the rare exception," Draven said, meeting her eyes directly with unwavering resolve. "I understand completely that you have no genuine reason yet to believe that promise. But I fully intend to earn that belief from you, one single day at a time, for however long it ultimately takes." Lyra studied him for a long, quiet moment, the heavy weight of the morning's events pressing steadily against her chest, the fragile new trust growing slowly between them, tested already by forces far beyond either of their control. Somewhere within these very palace walls, someone had betrayed her closely guarded secret to a rival house, before the morning had even fully ended. Somewhere nearby, Beatrice Calloway continued quietly building whatever case she genuinely believed would strengthen her own position against the king's careful judgment. And now, House Ravencrest had arrived bearing veiled threats and quiet promises of an alternative protection that Lyra trusted even less than the uncertain safety Draven currently offered her. "I need to know exactly who told him," Lyra said finally, her voice firm with sudden resolve. "Someone inside this palace spoke directly to House Ravencrest before this morning was even fully over. If we do not discover who, we will never truly be able to protect ourselves against whatever comes next." Draven nodded slowly, his expression grim but genuinely resolute. "Then we will find out together, whatever it takes." The investigation began quietly that same afternoon, deliberately kept far away from the council chamber and the watchful eyes of House Ravencrest's remaining guards, still lingering within the guest quarters. Draven summoned only two people he trusted completely and without reservation: a grizzled captain of the guard named Oliver Finch, who had faithfully served the royal family since long before Draven was even born, and a sharp young messenger named Charlotte Vale, whose steady loyalty had already been tested and proven many times over during the past several difficult years of palace service. They gathered together in the private study once more, the very same room where Lyra had first heard the astonishing truth of the mate bond spoken aloud to her. Oliver stood near the heavy door with his thick arms crossed firmly over his chest, his weathered face set in a deeply serious frown, while Charlotte perched carefully on the edge of a chair, a small leather ledger balanced neatly on her knee. Someone within these palace walls carried word directly to House Ravencrest before even mid-morning arrived, Draven said without any preamble whatsoever. "I want to know exactly who did this, and I want to understand precisely how word managed to travel that quickly across such a distance. There are only a small handful of ways a message could possibly reach Ravencrest territory that fast, Your Majesty," Oliver said thoughtfully, rubbing his chin. "A single rider would take the better part of a full day, even pushing a strong horse quite hard the entire way. That leaves us with either a trained messenger hawk, which requires specialized equipment and training that is not easily hidden from watchful eyes, or someone already stationed rather close to the border who received word through some other entirely different means." "A hawk," Charlotte said thoughtfully, glancing up briefly from her open ledger. "There have actually been several reports over the past month of an unfamiliar bird spotted near the Eastern Tower. I dismissed those particular reports at the time as nothing especially unusual, but perhaps I was genuinely wrong to do so." "The Eastern Tower overlooks my garden directly," Lyra said suddenly, the sudden realization striking her with startling clarity. "Whoever kept that particular hawk could have easily watched me tending my herbs each and every morning without ever once being seen themselves in return." Draven's expression hardened visibly at this new information. "Then we begin our search with the Eastern Tower immediately. Who exactly has regular access to that particular tower?" "Officially, only the tower guards specifically assigned to watch duty there," Oliver said. Though quite unofficially, nearly half the palace staff wander through that area at some point during their day, usually delivering routine messages or simply seeking a quiet place to rest during particularly long shifts. Then we need actual names, Draven said firmly. Everyone officially assigned to that tower over the past full month, along with anyone else seen entering or leaving without any clear or obvious purpose. Oliver nodded and departed swiftly to gather the necessary information, while Charlotte remained behind, flipping carefully through her detailed ledger of palace schedules and staff assignments. Lyra watched this entire process unfold with a strange, deeply unsettling feeling, as though she were finally glimpsing the hidden machinery of palace life that had always operated invisibly all around her during her 5 long years of careful, deliberate anonymity. "You have been quiet," Draven observed gently, once Charlotte had also excused herself briefly to cross-reference her notes against the official guard rosters kept in the archive. "I am trying to understand something," Lyra admitted quietly, staring into the fire. "For 5 entire years, I moved silently through this palace, believing myself completely invisible to everyone around me. Now I discover that Grace Whitmore actually knew my secret the entire time and kept it faithfully out of pure kindness, while someone else entirely may have been watching me just as closely, only to sell that same knowledge to House Ravencrest the very moment it became genuinely useful to them." She shook her head slowly, clearly troubled. "I honestly do not know how to trust anyone here anymore, including myself, forever believing I was truly hidden at all." Draven moved closer to her, though he deliberately stopped short of actually touching her, seeming to understand instinctively that she needed her own space, even as she simultaneously needed genuine comfort. "Trust is never something that returns easily once it has been badly broken," he said quietly, choosing his words with obvious care. "I understand that particular truth better than most people alive today. After everything that happened 6 years ago, I spent a very long time genuinely believing I could never trust anyone within these palace walls ever again. It took considerable time, and it took certain people proving themselves repeatedly through their actions, before I slowly began rebuilding even a small, careful circle of trust around myself." "How did you finally know when to stop being so afraid?" Lyra asked softly. "I am not entirely certain I ever fully did stop," Draven admitted, a faint, rueful smile touching his lips briefly. "I simply learned, over time, to be afraid more selectively than before, to trust in small, careful increments, rather than placing my full trust in anyone all at once. Oliver has earned my complete trust through an entire decade of consistently proven loyalty. Charlotte, through 2 full years of quiet, careful service that never once wavered under any real pressure." He met her eyes steadily. "Perhaps that is the actual answer you're looking for. Not trusting everyone completely, or trusting no one at all, but instead, learning to recognize the crucial difference, one single person at a time." Lyra considered his thoughtful words carefully, turning them slowly over in her mind. It was not the simple reassurance she had originally expected to hear, no grand sweeping promise that everything would somehow magically become safe again, but something far more honest, far more genuinely grounded in the harsh reality of the world she actually lived in every single day. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she genuinely appreciated this particular honesty more than any empty comfort ever could have offered her. A sharp knock interrupted this quiet, reflective moment, and Oliver returned promptly, his weathered expression notably grim. "Your Majesty, I have managed to gather a partial list already. 3 separate guards were officially assigned rotating watch duty in the Eastern Tower over the course of the past month. 2 of them have served this crown faithfully for many years, with absolutely no cause whatsoever for suspicion. The 3rd guard, however, is a fairly recent transfer from the southern garrison, a young man named Victor Hale." "I do not recognize that particular name at all," Draven said, frowning. "He transferred into palace service roughly 3 months ago, following a reassignment request that came through rather unusually quickly, for someone lacking any significant personal connections," Oliver continued carefully. "I made further inquiries after Charlotte flagged the unusual timing as potentially suspicious. It appears this Victor Hale actually has distant family ties to House Ravencrest, through a cousin who married into a lesser branch of their extended bloodline some years back." Draven's expression turned instantly to stone at this revelation. "Where exactly is he stationed right now, this very moment?" On active duty, Your Majesty. The Eastern Tower, as it happens, precisely where we would expect him to be. Bring him to me immediately, Draven said firmly. But do so quietly. I do not want word of this reaching any of Ravencrest's remaining guards before we have had a proper chance to question him thoroughly. Oliver nodded sharply and departed once more, and Lyra felt her pulse quicken noticeably, with a strange mixture of rising relief and renewed anxiety in equal measure. Relief that they had perhaps finally located the true source of this troubling betrayal. Anxiety at what actually confronting that betrayal directly might ultimately reveal, and what serious consequences might follow from it. It took nearly half an hour before Oliver finally returned, this time walking alongside a young guard, whose face was noticeably pale beneath a thin sheen of nervous sweat. Victor Hale could not have been much older than Lyra herself, with unremarkable sandy hair and an entirely forgettable face that likely served him rather well in a role that required quiet, unnoticed observation of others. Your Majesty, Victor said, his voice audibly unsteady as he offered a hurried, nervous bow. Victor Hale, Draven said, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to make the young guard visibly flinch. I understand that you have been quietly keeping a trained messenger hawk somewhere near the Eastern Tower. Victor's already pale face drained further of what little remaining color it still held. Your Majesty, do not lie to me, Draven interrupted sharply, his voice dropping low and genuinely dangerous. I have very little patience remaining today for outright lies, and even less patience for the serious consequences you will personally face, should I happen to catch you attempting one. Victor's shoulders slumped visibly, the last of his fight clearly draining out of him entirely. It is true, Your Majesty. I did keep a hawk there. I used it to send word secretly to a contact within House Ravencrest's own territory. Why exactly did you do this? Draven demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Money, Your Majesty, Victor admitted, genuine shame coloring his shaking voice. My own family struggled desperately after my father's serious illness left him entirely unable to work any longer. A representative from House Ravencrest approached me quietly shortly after my transfer here, offering steady payment in exchange for information about any unusual activity occurring within the palace. I never truly intended any real harm by this. I only reported what I personally observed, genuinely believing at the time it amounted to nothing more than minor gossip they would use for idle court politics, nothing more serious than that. You watched a woman quietly tend a hidden garden for weeks on end, Draven said, his voice rising slightly with barely controlled anger, and then reported her private activities directly to a rival house, and you genuinely believed all of that was somehow harmless? Victor's frightened eyes flicked briefly toward Lyra, visible guilt written plainly across his young, unremarkable features. I did not know exactly what she was hiding, Your Majesty. Not until this very morning, when the guards first reported the sudden scent disturbance. I sent word the very moment I finally understood the truth, genuinely believing it was simply my sworn duty to report unusual activity, exactly as I had been trained to do from the very beginning. Your sworn duty, Draven repeated coldly, was to this crown alone, not to House Ravencrest's coin. Victor said absolutely nothing further in his own defense, his head bowed low in evident shame, clearly understanding fully the severity of what he had actually done. Lyra watched this entire painful exchange with a strange, deeply complicated feeling settling slowly over her. Genuine anger at the betrayal itself, mixed unexpectedly with a flicker of real understanding for a desperate young man, cornered enough to compromise his sworn loyalty for the sake of his own struggling family. What exactly happens to him now? Lyra asked quietly, genuinely surprising even herself with the sudden question. Draven glanced toward her, something shifting visibly in his expression, at the unexpected mercy evident in her gentle tone. Treason against the crown typically carries rather severe consequences, he said carefully. Imprisonment, at the very minimum required by law. He did not act purely out of malice toward the crown, Lyra said slowly, carefully thinking through her own words even as she spoke them aloud. He acted out of genuine desperation, the very same way many desperate people often do when their circumstances leave them without any better available choices. I understand something quite personal about being cornered by circumstances entirely beyond your own control. Draven studied her carefully for a long, thoughtful moment, then turned his attention back to Victor. "You will be removed from all palace service immediately, and without exception, and you will face formal questioning regarding the complete extent of everything you shared with House Ravencrest. Depending entirely on what we ultimately learn from that questioning, further consequences may still follow, but I will genuinely consider the difficult circumstances of your family's hardship when finally determining your ultimate punishment." Victor's tense shoulders sagged with something falling somewhere between relief and continued dread. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I fully understand that I have betrayed your trust completely, and I accept whatever judgment you ultimately decide to impose upon me." Oliver led Victor away quietly, leaving Draven and Lyra alone once more together in the peaceful, quiet study. Draven exhaled slowly, some of the built-up tension finally leaving his shoulders now that at least one clear source of the troubling betrayal had been properly identified and contained. "You showed him genuine mercy," Draven observed thoughtfully, "after everything he did to endanger you so seriously. I have spent my entire life being the person others were either afraid of, or deeply ashamed of, or simply willing to sacrifice for their own personal survival," Lyra said quietly, her eyes distant. "I understand desperation far better than I understand simple cruelty. That does not mean what he actually did was right in any way, but it does mean I genuinely understand why he chose to do it." Draven's expression softened slowly into something that looked remarkably close to genuine admiration. "You continue to surprise me," he said honestly. "Every single time I believe I finally understand who you truly are, you reveal yet another layer I had not previously expected to find." "Is that meant as some kind of complaint, Your Majesty?" Lyra asked, a small, unexpected smile touching her lips for the very first time since the morning's considerable chaos had first begun. "Far from any complaint," Draven said, returning her smile with one of his own, considerably softer and more genuine than anything she had witnessed from him during their brief acquaintance so far. "I find myself rather looking forward to discovering the rest of who you are." The warm moment stretched quietly between them, fragile yet genuine, until a sharp knock at the door interrupted it entirely. Charlotte Vale entered quickly, her expression noticeably tight with fresh urgency written across it. "Your Majesty," she said, "Lord Ravencrest has formally requested one final audience before his planned departure. He claims he wishes only to offer proper farewells, but given everything we have just uncovered together, I thought you would certainly want to know immediately." Draven's jaw tightened visibly, the earlier warmth of the previous moment giving way once more to the sharp, careful calculation of a king navigating dangerous political waters. "Tell him I will meet him in the courtyard shortly," he said firmly. Then he turned back to Lyra, his expression suddenly serious. "Stay here, please, where it is safe. I do not want Edward Ravencrest anywhere near you again, before he finally leaves these grounds for good." Lyra nodded slowly, though a part of her, the same part that had spent 5 long years learning to face danger directly, rather than hiding from it, genuinely wished she could stand beside him, for whatever difficult conversation was about to unfold between them. She watched him go, the heavy door closing softly behind him, and settled quietly back into the chair by the fire once more, her mind turning steadily over everything that had happened since dawn had first broken, painfully aware that this strange, dangerous new chapter of her life had only just truly begun. Edward Ravencrest waited patiently in the courtyard beside his horse, his dark cloak stirring gently in the afternoon breeze, an expression of calm, practiced patience masking whatever true intentions actually lay hidden beneath his carefully composed exterior. Draven approached him with measured, deliberate steps, keeping his own expression carefully neutral throughout, despite the lingering anger still simmering steadily beneath the surface from that morning's troubling revelations. "Lord Ravencrest," Draven said formally, "I understand you wish to offer proper farewells before your planned departure." "Indeed, Your Majesty," Edward replied smoothly, his tone perfectly pleasant. "Though I confess, I also hope to leave you with one small piece of counsel, offered entirely in the spirit of the fragile peace our two houses have long carefully maintained." "I am listening carefully," Draven said, though his tone clearly suggested he expected very little genuine value in whatever counsel Edward intended to share with him. An unregistered Omega, discovered hiding quietly within a palace for years on end, tends to attract attention from considerably more than simply curious neighboring houses, Edward said, his voice carrying a deceptively gentle warning beneath its polished, diplomatic surface. There are those who trade openly in such valuable secrets for considerably higher stakes than mere idle gossip. I would strongly advise Your Majesty to secure her position quickly and formally, before someone considerably less scrupulous than myself decides to properly test the true strength of your claim over her." "Is that meant to be a threat, Lord Ravencrest?" Draven asked, his voice dropping into something low and genuinely dangerous. "A warning, Your Majesty," Edward said, mounting his horse with practiced, effortless grace. "Delivered entirely out of genuine concern for the continued stability between our two great houses. What other, considerably less honorable parties might attempt, once word spreads further beyond these walls, falls entirely outside my own personal control." Without waiting for any further response, Edward turned his horse smoothly toward the northern gate, his retinue falling swiftly into formation behind him, and within only a few short minutes, House Ravencrest's distinctive banners had disappeared completely beyond the palace walls, leaving only an unsettling, heavy quiet in their wake. Draven remained standing motionless in the courtyard for a long moment afterward, turning Edward's carefully chosen words over repeatedly in his mind, understanding fully the deeper implication buried carefully within that measured diplomatic language. Word of Lyra's true existence would not remain safely contained within Ashenmoor's walls for very much longer, regardless of how carefully he tried to protect that particular secret. Other neighboring houses, other alphas hungry for the kind of significant advantage an unclaimed Omega might represent to their own ambitions, would soon come seeking their own personal opportunities as well. He returned quietly to his study to find Lyra exactly where he had left her earlier, though she rose immediately from her chair the moment he entered the room, searching his face closely for any hint of news. "What exactly did he say to you?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "Nothing that I did not already genuinely fear," Draven admitted, closing the heavy study door firmly behind him. "He believes that word of your existence will inevitably spread well beyond Ashenmoor, regardless of any efforts we make to contain it properly. He suggested rather pointedly that I secure your position formally before other neighboring houses decide to test my claim over you directly for themselves." Lyra's expression tightened noticeably with fresh, rising worry. "What exactly does securing my position formally even mean in practice?" Draven hesitated briefly, choosing his next words with obvious care. According to the old traditions of this particular kingdom, an alpha may formally claim his fated mate through a proper bonding ceremony, one recognized fully by both law and by the pack itself. Once such a bond is completed, no other alpha may ever challenge that particular claim without directly challenging the crown itself in the process. An act of open war that very few houses would ever risk lightly. "A bonding ceremony," Lyra repeated slowly, fully understanding the considerable weight behind his careful words. "You are suggesting that we formally claim each other, publicly, before witnesses. I am not suggesting we rush headlong into anything that neither of us genuinely wants for ourselves," Draven clarified quickly. "I only wish for you to fully understand the reality of our current situation. The protection I have already offered you today remains strong, but it is still entirely informal. A formal bond would prove considerably stronger still, though I would never ask that particular commitment of you before you feel genuinely ready, if you are ever truly ready for it at all." Lyra crossed slowly to the window, staring quietly out at the darkening evening sky beyond the palace grounds, her thoughts a tangled, confusing mixture of fear, uncertainty, and something else entirely, something warmer and considerably more fragile, that had been slowly growing steadily throughout this long, extraordinary day. "I need some time to think," she said finally. "This morning, I woke up simply as an invisible servant, carrying a secret I had carefully protected for 5 entire years. Now, I am being asked to seriously consider bonding myself, formally and permanently, to the king of an entire kingdom. That is genuinely not a decision I can reasonably make within the space of a single day, regardless of whatever pressure any rival house chooses to apply." "I understand that completely," Draven said gently, moving to stand quietly beside her at the window. "And I meant precisely what I said earlier. I will not force this particular decision upon you, no matter what outside pressure continues gathering beyond these walls. You genuinely deserve the chance to choose this path freely for yourself, or to choose against it entirely, if that is what you ultimately decide." They stood together in comfortable, companionable silence for a while, quietly watching the last remaining light of day slowly fade behind the distant hills, the considerable events of the long morning finally beginning to settle into something Lyra could actually process more clearly in her own mind. Despite everything that had happened, despite the very real fear and uncertainty, and the genuinely real dangers now gathering steadily around her, she found herself feeling grateful, in a way she had not fully expected, for the strange, extraordinary series of events that had ultimately led her here to this quiet moment. "Tell me about her," Lyra said softly, finally breaking the comfortable silence between them. "The woman who betrayed you, 6 years ago now. If you are genuinely willing to share that story with me." Draven remained quiet for a long moment, and Lyra briefly wondered if she had overstepped some unspoken boundary, asking for too much too soon in their fragile new understanding. But then he slowly began to speak, his voice measured and careful, the particular way someone speaks about old wounds that have mostly healed over time, but never quite disappeared entirely from memory. "Her name was Isolde," he said quietly. "She arrived at court claiming to be the daughter of a minor noble family from the distant western provinces, seeking a modest position among the palace staff. I was young at the time, still learning the true weight of the crown I would eventually inherit, and she was clever, endlessly patient, and remarkably kind, in a way that felt entirely genuine at the time it was happening." He paused, remembering. "We grew steadily close together over the course of nearly a full year. I genuinely believed I had finally found someone who saw me as considerably more than simply the future king, someone who truly valued who I actually was as a person." "What happened between you?" Lyra asked gently. "My own father's health began failing seriously around that very same time," Draven continued, his voice growing quieter. "Isolde began asking careful, pointed questions about palace security, about troop movements, about the finer details of succession planning, questions I dismissed at the time as simply harmless curiosity from someone genuinely invested in my future prospects. It was not until my father's own personal guard intercepted a coded message clearly intended for a rival house that the full, painful truth finally came out. Isolde had been deliberately placed within the palace from the very beginning, carefully gathering sensitive information meant to weaken our defenses ahead of a planned incursion." "I am truly sorry," Lyra said quietly, watching him closely. "The very worst part was never the simple deception itself," Draven admitted honestly. "It was slowly realizing exactly how completely I had allowed myself to be blinded by it. I had always prided myself on being observant, careful, genuinely difficult to manipulate. Yet I somehow missed every single warning sign for nearly a full year, simply because I wanted so badly to believe that someone could genuinely care for me beyond the crown I would eventually be forced to wear." He turned to look at her directly, his golden eyes steady. "That is precisely why I built the careful walls I built afterward. Not because I stopped believing genuine connection was possible somewhere out there, but because I stopped trusting my own personal judgment to properly recognize it when it finally appeared." "And now?" Lyra asked softly. "Now, my own wolf recognized you completely, the very moment I first caught your scent, well before I even knew your proper name, well before politics or duty or careful calculation ever had any real chance to interfere with that recognition," Draven said. "That particular kind of recognition does not come from judgment that can ever be deceived. It comes from something considerably deeper, something I trust far more completely than I have trusted anything at all in 6 long years." He offered her a small, genuinely hopeful smile. "That does not mean I expect you to trust me in that same exact way. Not yet. Perhaps not for a very long time. But I wanted you to fully understand why, despite everything currently happening around us today, I feel more genuinely certain about this particular bond than I have felt about almost anything else since I first took this throne." Lyra felt something warm and fragile slowly bloom deep within her chest, a feeling she had not truly allowed herself to experience in considerably longer than she could clearly remember. She had spent 5 entire years carefully guarding not only her scent, but her own heart as well, genuinely certain that trust and connection were simply luxuries she could never afford to indulge in. Yet standing here quietly beside this king, listening to him speak so honestly about his own deep wounds and lingering fears, she found herself wanting, for the very first time in considerably longer than she could remember, to genuinely believe that something entirely different might actually be possible for her. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning it completely, for trusting me enough to share that with me. Thank you, for choosing to stay and hear it through, Draven replied gently. A soft knock interrupted this quiet, tender moment, and Grace Whitmore entered carrying a simple tray of food, her expression carefully neutral throughout, though Lyra caught the small, knowing glance she offered, before setting the tray down carefully and departing quietly once more. Draven gestured toward the small table positioned near the fire, and for the very first time since the considerable chaos of that long morning had first begun, they finally shared a quiet, peaceful meal together, speaking now of smaller, considerably gentler things, slowly learning small, meaningful details about each other that had nothing whatsoever to do with politics, danger, or the powerful mate bond steadily pulling them together. Lyra learned that Draven had once dreamed quietly of becoming a healer before the sheer weight of royal succession made that particular dream entirely impossible for him, that he still kept a small, carefully hidden collection of medical texts tucked away in his private chambers, studied quietly during the rare, precious moments of genuine peace he managed to find. Draven learned in turn that Lyra had taught herself to read using scattered scraps of discarded parchment during her long years of careful hiding, that she found genuine, deep comfort in the patient, careful work of tending growing things, watching new life slowly take root and gradually flourish under careful, dedicated attention over time. As the evening deepened steadily into full night, and the fire burned low and warm within the hearth, Lyra realized, with a mixture of genuine surprise and quiet wonder, that despite everything currently threatening them from beyond these palace walls, she had not felt this genuinely safe, this truly at ease, in considerably longer than she could remember experiencing in her entire life. But even as that fragile, precious peace settled slowly over the quiet study that evening, somewhere far beyond the palace walls, Beatrice Calloway sat alone within her private chambers, a single candle burning low beside a carefully organized stack of gathered notes. Her sharp, calculating mind already working steadily through the early beginnings of a plan that would test the fragile bond forming between the king and his newly discovered hidden Omega, far sooner and far more dangerously than either one of them yet fully realized. Morning arrived far too quickly the following day, and with it came a formal summons Draven had been quietly dreading ever since the previous evening had drawn to its peaceful close. A full council session had been officially called, requested personally by Beatrice Calloway herself, with every single senior advisor formally required to attend without exception. Draven read the written message through twice, his expression growing noticeably darker with each careful pass, before he finally set the parchment aside and turned to face Lyra, who watched him closely with quiet, mounting apprehension. "What exactly is it?" she asked, setting down her morning tea with sudden, visible unease. "Calloway has formally called a full session," Draven said grimly. "She very rarely does this, unless she genuinely believes she holds enough solid evidence to force a decision the wider council might otherwise prefer to avoid entirely." He rubbed a tired hand across his weary eyes. "I strongly suspect she intends to challenge my protection of you directly, before the assembled full council, where informal royal decree carries considerably less binding weight than it does during any private conversation between us." Lyra's stomach tightened sharply with anxious dread. What exactly happens if she actually succeeds in this? "She will not succeed," Draven said firmly, though Lyra could clearly hear the underlying tension threading through his voice, the quiet acknowledgement that this particular outcome was genuinely far from guaranteed. "But we do need to be properly prepared for whatever she ultimately intends to present before the council today." They arrived together at the council chamber, to find it considerably fuller than Lyra had ever witnessed before. Nearly a full dozen advisors and senior nobles seated closely around the long table, their varied expressions ranging widely from simple curiosity to openly displayed suspicion. Beatrice Calloway stood waiting at the head of the gathering, a thin folder of carefully prepared papers held steadily in her hands, her composed bearing radiating the quiet confidence of someone who genuinely believed victory was already firmly secured. "Your Majesty," Calloway said, offering a properly formal bow, as Draven took his seat at the head of the long table, Lyra positioned carefully beside him, rather than relegated to the distant servants' corner, where she might once have been forced to stand in years past. "Thank you sincerely for granting this particular audience today." "Speak plainly, Lady Calloway," Draven said evenly, What specific evidence do you genuinely believe warrants calling a full council session on this matter? Calloway opened her prepared folder carefully, laying several documents across the polished table with deliberate, practiced precision. Sworn testimony from a former palace guard, one Victor Hale, regarding an unregistered Omega, discovered cultivating scent-masking herbs within these very walls for a period of no less than 5 full years. Additionally, we have confirmed reports that House Ravencrest possessed clear knowledge of this entire situation, well before Your Majesty's own council was even fully informed, raising rather serious questions about precisely how such sensitive information managed to travel beyond these palace walls so quickly. Low murmurs rippled steadily around the crowded table, and Lyra felt every single eye in the chamber shift slowly toward her, the considerable weight of their collective scrutiny pressing down upon her like an almost physical force. She kept her chin lifted with quiet determination, firmly refusing to shrink beneath their combined gazes the way 5 entire years of careful invisibility had once trained her to instinctively do. Victor Hale has already fully confessed to selling sensitive information to House Ravencrest for his own personal financial gain, Draven said evenly, meeting Calloway's gaze directly. That particular matter has already been properly addressed. I genuinely fail to see how it constitutes any new evidence requiring this council's direct intervention now. With the greatest respect, Your Majesty, this particular matter extends well beyond Victor Hale's individual betrayal alone, Calloway continued smoothly, clearly prepared for this exact objection. This council must carefully consider the significant precedent being established here. An unregistered Omega, cultivated and deliberately hidden without any royal knowledge for 5 full years, now suddenly claimed under royal protection on the very same morning, her existence becomes genuinely impossible to conceal any longer. Some members among this council rightfully question whether this particular arrangement truly serves the genuine interests of the crown, or whether it instead represents a rather hasty decision, made entirely under the powerful influence of an unverified mate bond. Unverified, Draven repeated slowly, his voice carrying a distinctly dangerous edge. Are you genuinely suggesting that my own personal instincts, my own wolf's own judgment, cannot be reasonably trusted to recognize a truly genuine mate bond when it finally appears before him? I am suggesting, Your Majesty, Calloway said carefully, choosing each word with obvious precision, that mate bonds, while undeniably powerful in their own right, have historically been exploited on occasion by those clever enough to carefully manufacture the outward appearance of one. I raise this particular point not to directly accuse Miss Ashwood of anything herself, but simply to ensure that this council properly performs its rightful duty of careful verification before formally recognizing any bond that would carry such significant political consequences for this entire kingdom going forward. Lyra felt genuine anger rising hot and sharp beneath her carefully maintained, controlled exterior. She had spent her entire life being spoken about by others, rather than genuinely spoken to directly, her own personal fate repeatedly decided by others who saw her as nothing more than a complication to be carefully managed and contained. She would not sit silently through this particular conversation, regardless of how genuinely dangerous speaking out openly might ultimately prove to be for her. May I address this council directly, Your Majesty? Lyra asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the pounding of her own racing heart. Genuine surprise flickered visibly across several faces gathered around that long table, clearly unaccustomed to any servant, let alone an unregistered Omega, formally requesting to speak during such formal proceedings. Draven glanced toward her, a brief flicker of concern crossing his features, though he offered her a small, genuinely encouraging nod of support. The council formally recognizes Miss Ashwood, Draven announced clearly. Lyra rose slowly from her chair, meeting the watchful eyes of every single advisor gathered around that long table, deliberately refusing to look away, despite every instinct urging her to shrink back into familiar, comfortable invisibility. I did not manufacture anything whatsoever, she said clearly, her voice carrying steadily throughout the hushed chamber. I have spent 5 entire years hiding my true nature, not out of any deliberate deception aimed against this crown, but out of genuine, overwhelming fear for my own survival. A fear born directly from watching my own mother die, at the hands of raiders who saw Omegas as nothing more than mere property, to be seized and sold. I never once sought royal protection for myself, never sought any personal influence, never sought anything at all beyond the simple, basic ability to live quietly and safely within these walls, unnoticed and unbothered. She paused briefly, carefully gathering her considerable courage, before continuing her address. The mate bond that now connects me to King Draven was not something either one of us deliberately chose or carefully manufactured for our own benefit. It revealed itself entirely by accident, the very moment his wolf, caught in a completely unrelated moment of personal distress, happened to destroy the very herbs that had faithfully protected me for 5 full years. If this particular council wishes to seriously question the timing of that unexpected revelation, I would gently remind you all that neither King Draven nor myself ever controlled the circumstances of that particular morning. A heavy silence fell across the entire chamber following her words, several advisors exchanging uncertain, thoughtful glances with one another, clearly unprepared for such direct, honest testimony from someone they had fully expected to remain silent throughout these formal proceedings. Beatrice Calloway's carefully composed expression flickered, just slightly, though she recovered her composure quickly enough. "A genuinely compelling account, Miss Ashwood," Calloway said smoothly, "though personal accounts alone cannot fully verify the true authenticity of a bond carrying such significant political weight for this kingdom. I formally propose that this council request proper verification through traditional established means, a formal ceremony conducted before qualified witnesses fully capable of confirming the bond's genuine legitimacy beyond simple spoken testimony alone." Draven's eyes narrowed sharply at this proposal. "You are proposing that a formal bonding ceremony be forced directly upon us, before this entire council, as a strict condition of continued protection?" "I am proposing proper verification, Your Majesty," Calloway said carefully, "nothing more than that. Should the bond ultimately prove genuine, as I am quite certain Your Majesty firmly believes it truly will, this council would have no further legitimate grounds for concern whatsoever, and Miss Ashwood's protection would become formally, legally secured, beyond any future challenge from outside houses." Lyra understood immediately, and completely, the careful trap being constructed around them both. If they refused this proposal outright, Calloway would surely use their reluctance as further evidence of genuine doubt, further eroding whatever remaining authority Draven's informal protection currently held. If they agreed instead, they would find themselves forced into a deeply personal, permanent commitment on a timeline dictated entirely by political pressure rather than genuine personal readiness. She glanced quickly toward Draven, searching his expression carefully for guidance, and found him watching her with quiet, searching intensity, clearly leaving this particular decision, at least in part, entirely up to her own judgment. "I understand fully this council's genuine concerns," Lyra said slowly, choosing her next words with careful, deliberate precision. "But I would respectfully ask that any decision regarding a formal bonding ceremony be made in proper time, entirely free from any pressure specifically designed to force a hasty, premature outcome. A genuinely authentic mate bond does not require rushed verification to prove its own inherent authenticity. It requires only patience, and perhaps a genuine willingness from this council to trust their own king's careful judgment, exactly as they have presumably trusted it already, on matters of far greater consequence, throughout the entirety of his reign so far." Several advisors seated around the table nodded slowly in apparent agreement, clearly swayed by the reasonable, carefully measured tone of her thoughtful response. Even Lord Halden, who had seemed genuinely troubled by this entire situation from the very beginning, offered a small, approving nod of agreement. "This council will take Miss Ashwood's words fully under careful consideration," Halden said firmly, speaking quickly before Calloway could press the matter any further. "Your Majesty, I believe this particular matter can reasonably be revisited during some future session, once the current tensions surrounding House Ravencrest's rather unexpected visit have settled more fully and completely." Draven seized this opening immediately, and firmly. "I fully agree with Lord Halden's careful assessment here. This particular session is now concluded, unless there remains further urgent business requiring this council's immediate attention today." No one present spoke any further objection, and slowly, the assembled advisors began rising steadily from their seats, murmuring quietly among themselves as they filed carefully out of the crowded chamber one by one. Beatrice Calloway remained seated a moment longer than the rest, her sharp, calculating eyes fixed steadily on Lyra, with an expression holding grudging respect mixed carefully with continued, lingering wariness. "Well spoken indeed, Miss Ashwood," Calloway said finally, gathering her scattered papers with deliberate, careful precision. "Though I would strongly caution you against believing this particular matter fully resolved just yet, I remain genuinely concerned, sincerely concerned, for the continued stability of this crown. That deep concern does not simply disappear, entirely because of one well-delivered speech, however genuinely compelling it may have been." "I do not expect it to disappear," Lyra replied evenly, holding the older woman's gaze steadily. "But I would ask that you please remember, whatever your ongoing concerns regarding this crown may be, I am not your enemy in this matter, Lady Calloway. I never once sought any part of this situation for myself." Calloway studied her closely for a long, quiet moment, something unreadable passing briefly behind her sharp, calculating eyes, before she finally nodded once and departed without any further comment, leaving Draven and Lyra alone together in the slowly emptying chamber. "That performance was genuinely remarkable," Draven said quietly, once the very last advisor had finally departed the room. "I have personally watched seasoned diplomats fail to navigate Calloway's careful traps as gracefully as you just managed to do. I have spent 5 entire years learning how to survive rooms full of powerful people who held complete power over my own fate," Lyra said, a note of weary, honest exhaustion clear in her tired voice. "I suppose today simply required a somewhat different kind of survival from me." Draven reached out gently, taking her hand carefully in his own, and this time, Lyra did not pull away from his touch. "You handled yourself today as though you were genuinely born to stand in that particular room," he said softly, "as though you were truly born to stand proudly beside a throne." "I never once wanted a throne for myself," Lyra said softly, looking up at him. "I only ever wanted to feel genuinely safe." "Perhaps," Draven said gently, "those two particular things are not nearly as separate from one another as you once firmly believed them to be." They stood together quietly, in the peaceful aftermath of that difficult council session, the fragile bond steadily growing between them, growing noticeably steadier. With each shared challenge they continued facing together, side by side. Though neither one of them could yet fully know just how many further challenges still waited patiently for them beyond these palace walls, gathering slowly and quietly in the deep shadows of political ambition and personal vengeance alike. 3 weeks passed steadily by, with a fragile, cautious peace gradually settling over the entire palace. Lyra had been formally given proper quarters near the royal wing itself, well away from the crowded servants' dormitory she had called home for 5 entire years, and though the sudden adjustment felt strange and genuinely unfamiliar to her at first, she found herself slowly growing accustomed to a completely different life than she had ever once dared to imagine for herself. She and Draven spent countless quiet evenings together, whenever his many royal duties allowed, gradually learning each other's small habits, quiet fears, and simple joys, the deepening bond between them growing steadily more natural with each passing day, rather than through any kind of forced or rushed ceremony. But genuine peace within these palace walls did not necessarily mean genuine peace existed beyond them as well, and Lyra was firmly reminded of that harsh, unavoidable reality when Draven informed her, over a quiet shared breakfast one morning, of an approaching diplomatic gathering that would soon require her formal presence alongside him. "A gathering of exactly what kind?" Lyra asked, setting down her teacup with sudden, rising apprehension. "A seasonal council gathering held among all the neighboring houses," Draven explained carefully. "Held once, every single year, to properly discuss important matters of trade, border security, and general regional diplomacy. Every single ruling house sends their own official representatives. It would be considered quite unusual for me to attend without you standing at my side, given that word of our particular bond has already spread this far across the region." "House Ravencrest will certainly be there," Lyra said, understanding the implication immediately. "Quite likely, yes," Draven admitted, "along with several other neighboring houses, some genuine allies, others considerably less certain in their true loyalties toward Ashenmoor. I would never ask you to attend if I genuinely believed it to be unsafe, but avoiding this particular gathering entirely would send a clear message of weakness that could easily invite exactly the kind of challenges we are actively trying to prevent from happening." Lyra considered his careful words thoughtfully, weighing the lingering fear still coiled tightly in her chest, against the quiet inner strength she had recently discovered within herself during that difficult council session weeks earlier. "I will attend with you," she said finally, her voice firm with resolve. "I refuse to hide from this challenge, not after everything we have already faced and overcome together so far." The gathering itself was held within a grand, neutral hall situated carefully between the major surrounding territories, a sprawling estate specifically maintained for such important diplomatic occasions, staffed entirely by neutral parties, formally sworn to serve no single house above any other. Lyra had genuinely never seen anything quite like it before in her life. Vast halls decorated elaborately with banners, representing a dozen different territories, nobles and powerful alphas from across the entire region, mingling together in careful, calculated conversation beneath enormous, sparkling crystal chandeliers. She stayed carefully close to Draven's side throughout the long evening, her nerves stretched increasingly taut despite the elegant gown Grace Whitmore had personally helped her prepare earlier that day. Despite the careful confidence she worked hard to project outward to everyone watching. Draven introduced her formally to several allied houses throughout the evening, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back throughout each individual exchange. And though several curious nobles regarded her with open, undisguised curiosity, most extended polite, if somewhat reserved, courtesy toward her. It was during one brief moment of separation, when Draven had been pulled aside by an important ally requesting a private word regarding certain border trade agreements, that Lyra felt the familiar, unwelcome prickle of unwanted attention crawling steadily across her skin once again. She turned to find Edward Ravencrest approaching her directly, a glass of dark red wine held casually in hand, his expression carrying that same smooth, calculating charm she remembered clearly from their previous unpleasant encounter. "Miss Ashwood," Edward said smoothly, offering a shallow, mocking bow. "You look remarkably well today, given the rather tumultuous circumstances surrounding our last meeting together." "Lord Ravencrest," Lyra replied evenly, working hard to keep her genuine discomfort from showing on her face. "I trust your journey here today was reasonably uneventful." "Quite uneventful indeed," Edward agreed smoothly, his sharp eyes studying her closely, with an intensity that made her skin crawl uncomfortably. "Though I confess, I have thought rather often about our previous conversation together. I meant precisely what I offered you that day, Miss Ashwood. House Ravencrest would genuinely welcome someone possessing your rather unique qualities, should circumstances ever happen to change your current arrangement here." "My current circumstances have not changed, and they will not be changing," Lyra said firmly, meeting his gaze directly. "I would ask that you please not raise this particular subject with me again." Edward's easy smile did not waver in the slightest, though something considerably colder flickered briefly behind his calculating eyes. "Of course, Miss Ashwood. Please forgive my continued persistence on this matter. It is simply rather difficult for me to watch someone of such evident personal value remain confined entirely to a single kingdom's protection, when far broader opportunities might genuinely serve you so much better in the end." Before Lyra could offer any response to this, Draven appeared quickly at her side once more, his expression tightening visibly the moment he registered Edward's unwelcome presence beside her. "Lord Ravencrest," Draven said, his voice carrying a clear, unmistakable warning beneath its outwardly formal courtesy. "I trust you are genuinely enjoying this evening's gathering." "Immensely so, Your Majesty," Edward said smoothly, offering another shallow bow, before finally departing without any further comment, though not before casting one last, lingering glance toward Lyra that left a cold, heavy weight settling deep in the pit of her stomach. "What exactly did he say to you this time?" Draven asked, once Edward had melted quietly back into the surrounding crowd. "The very same offer as before," Lyra said quietly, delivered with that same false, practiced charm as always. "I refused him again, clearly and quite firmly this time." Draven's jaw tightened visibly at this news. "I genuinely do not like the particular way he looks at you, Lyra. As though he is already carefully calculating exactly how to take what he wants from you, entirely regardless of your clear and repeated refusal." "I noticed that very same troubling thing myself," Lyra admitted quietly, glancing toward where Edward had disappeared into the crowd. "Perhaps we should genuinely consider leaving this gathering somewhat earlier than we had originally planned." Draven nodded slowly in agreement, already scanning the crowded hall around them with renewed, careful wariness. Let me quickly finish the remaining formal introductions that are still required of us. We will depart from here within the hour, I promise you. But an entire hour proved to be considerably more time than they were ultimately given that evening. As the night deepened steadily, and the gathering shifted gradually toward its final formal ceremonies of the evening, a sudden commotion erupted near the hall's eastern entrance, sharp shouts and the distinct sound of scattering glass cutting harshly through the ambient conversation filling the grand hall. Draven's head snapped instantly toward the sudden disturbance, his protective instincts flaring immediately, and he reached instinctively for Lyra's hand beside him, only to find the space where she had been standing entirely empty. "Lyra?" he called out, scanning the crowded hall with rapidly rising alarm. She had been standing quietly right beside him, only moments before, speaking softly with an ally's wife about the herb garden she genuinely hoped to eventually rebuild back home. Now, in the sudden chaos of the unexpected commotion, she was nowhere to be found, anywhere in the crowded hall. "Lyra," Draven called out again, considerably louder this time, pushing urgently through the startled, confused crowd with growing, genuine desperation building inside him. He caught sight of Grace Whitmore, standing near the refreshment table, her face notably pale with fear. "Your Majesty," Grace said urgently, her voice shaking slightly. "I saw her being led quietly toward the eastern gardens, just moments before this commotion actually started. I thought it seemed rather strange at the time, but I simply assumed she needed a moment of fresh air." "Led by exactly whom?" Draven demanded, his voice tight with mounting alarm. "I did not recognize him clearly, Your Majesty. A tall man dressed entirely in dark clothing, unfamiliar to me personally." Draven's blood ran instantly cold, with sudden, terrible understanding flooding through him. The commotion at the eastern entrance had not been any kind of simple accident. It had been a deliberate, carefully planned distraction, precisely timed to pull everyone's attention away from whatever was actually happening quietly in the gardens beyond the hall. He pushed urgently through the dense crowd with renewed, desperate urgency, his wolf already straining fiercely beneath his own skin, pure instinct rapidly overriding any careful royal composure entirely. He reached the garden entrance to find it eerily, unnervingly quiet, the commotion still echoing faintly behind him from inside the hall, and there, scattered carelessly across the pale garden stones, he found a single, deeply unmistakable object waiting for him. Lyra's shawl, the very one Grace had carefully draped over her shoulders earlier that same evening, lying discarded carelessly on the cold ground, along with the faint but unmistakable lingering scent of a genuine struggle having taken place there. "No," Draven whispered, dropping instantly to his knees beside the fallen shawl, his hands trembling visibly with a fury and genuine terror, unlike anything he had personally experienced since the terrible day he had lost his own father. "No, no, no, this cannot be happening." Behind him, Oliver Finch arrived at a full, urgent run, his weathered expression grim, with immediate understanding, the moment he saw the troubling scene laid out before him. "Your Majesty, we absolutely need to move quickly now. Whoever took her cannot possibly have gotten very far yet." Draven rose slowly back to his feet, his eyes burning gold with barely contained rage, his wolf clawing desperately beneath the surface, utterly desperate to be released in immediate pursuit of the mate that had been so violently torn from him through deception and violence. Somewhere beyond these garden walls, someone had dared to take what rightfully belonged to him, what his very soul had already recognized completely as his own, and every single instinct in his entire body screamed loudly for immediate retribution. "Gather the full guard immediately," Draven said, his voice low and genuinely dangerous, in a way none of his gathered advisors had ever personally heard from him before. "Every single available rider we have, we ride within the hour, and we do not stop riding for anything until she is finally found safe." Oliver nodded sharply and departed immediately, shouting urgent orders that sent the entire neutral estate into sudden, carefully controlled chaos, guards and horses being readied swiftly, with hurried, desperate urgency all around. Draven remained standing alone amid the quiet garden for one final moment, clutching Lyra's fallen shawl tightly in his shaking hand, the faint scent of her still lingering softly against the delicate fabric. "I will find you," he whispered quietly into the darkening evening air, a solemn promise made not to anyone who could actually hear him speak it aloud, but to himself alone, and to the fierce, unbreakable bond that would not rest peacefully until she was finally safe once again in his arms. Whatever it ultimately takes from me, I promise you, I will find you. Behind him, the diplomatic gathering continued its own uneasy chaos. Nobles and alphas from a dozen different houses, whispering urgently among themselves, some with genuine, sincere concern for what had happened, others with carefully hidden satisfaction, as word spread quickly throughout the hall that the Alpha King's newly claimed mate had vanished suddenly into the night, taken by hands and intentions that still remained entirely unknown to everyone present. Lyra woke slowly to the rhythmic jolt of a moving carriage, her wrists bound tightly together in front of her, her aching head throbbing painfully from whatever had struck her unconscious back in the garden. She kept her eyes closed for a long, careful moment, deliberately forcing her breathing to remain steady and even, quietly gathering her scattered senses together, before revealing to anyone watching that she had actually regained full consciousness. She remembered only fragments of what had happened. A rough hand closing suddenly over her mouth from behind, dragging her forcefully away from the quiet garden path she had been walking along. A cloth pressed firmly against her face, sweet and sharp-smelling all at once, before complete darkness had claimed her, entirely without warning. Now, wherever she currently found herself, the steady rumble of wooden wheels against packed earth strongly suggested they had already been traveling together for a considerable amount of time. She cracked her eyes open just barely enough to carefully assess her immediate surroundings, without revealing that she had woken. The carriage interior was dim and shadowed, lit only by a single small lantern, swinging gently back and forth with the vehicle's constant motion. Seated directly across from her was a man she did not recognize at all, broad-shouldered and completely silent, his cold eyes fixed steadily on her with the patient, careful watchfulness of someone paid quite well to ensure she did not attempt any kind of escape. Beside him, unmistakably and infuriatingly, sat Edward Ravencrest himself, his expression calm and deeply satisfied in the flickering, dim lantern light. "Ah," Edward said, immediately noticing her open eyes despite her careful attempt at continued pretense. "Finally awake, I see. I do apologize sincerely for the rather unpleasant method of your relocation, Miss Ashwood, but you truly left me with very little other choice, given your continued stubborn refusals." Lyra pushed herself upright despite her tightly bound wrists, sudden fury overtaking the lingering fog of whatever powerful drug had been used against her earlier. "You genuinely dare to do this," she said, her voice shaking visibly with barely controlled rage. "After everything you personally claimed about respecting the fragile peace between our two houses." "Peace serves its own useful purpose only until it no longer does so effectively," Edward said with an easy, careless shrug of his shoulders. "House Ravencrest has patiently waited 3 full generations for exactly this kind of opportunity to finally weaken Ashenmoor's throne from within. A king publicly humiliated by the sudden loss of his newly claimed mate, entirely unable to properly protect even someone standing within his own palace walls, presents precisely the kind of visible weakness my house has long, patiently sought to exploit." "You are deliberately using me," Lyra said, her voice tight with anger, "as nothing more than a simple political weapon against him." "I am using you as valuable leverage," Edward corrected smoothly, taking a slow sip of wine from a small flask. "There is an important difference between the two, though perhaps it is admittedly a rather subtle one to notice. Once King Draven fully understands the precise terms required for your safe return, terms that will require rather significant concessions regarding disputed border territory and valuable trade rights currently held firmly by Ashenmoor, I fully imagine he will prove quite remarkably cooperative in securing your eventual safe release from us." Lyra's mind raced rapidly, carefully calculating every possible option currently available to her, despite her tightly bound wrists, and the heavily armed guard watching her every single movement closely. She thought back to the many years spent surviving beneath dusty floorboards, hiding carefully within shifting palace shadows, patiently learning to read both danger and opportunity with equal, practiced precision over time. "You genuinely believe Draven will simply hand over valuable territory to secure my release from you?" Lyra asked, working hard to keep her voice steady, despite the very real fear coiling tightly in her chest. "I believe," Edward said thoughtfully, "that a freshly formed fated mate bond, not yet fully secured through any formal ceremony, creates a rather desperate, powerful kind of devotion within an alpha's heart. King Draven strikes me personally as exactly the kind of man who would willingly sacrifice a very great deal indeed to properly protect what his own wolf has already claimed as entirely irreplaceable to him. Lyra said nothing further in response, instead turning her gaze quietly toward the small window set into the carriage door, watching the dark, unfamiliar shapes of the surrounding countryside blur steadily past in the pale moonlight outside. She desperately needed time to think clearly, needed to find some way to slow this dangerous journey, some genuine opportunity to signal her location, or create a real chance at escape, before they finally reached whatever destination Edward currently intended for her. Long hours passed steadily by in tense, watchful silence, the carriage eventually slowing considerably, as they gradually approached what appeared to be a remote hunting lodge, situated deep within unfamiliar forest, far from any road that Lyra could personally recognize. She was led firmly inside, still bound tightly, and confined immediately to a small, sparse room, featuring a single shuttered window and one heavy locked door, with the armed guard posted directly outside in the hallway beyond. Alone now in the growing darkness, Lyra allowed herself one brief moment of genuine, overwhelming fear, hot tears pricking sharply at her tired eyes as the considerable weight of her current situation finally settled fully over her exhausted mind and body. But she deliberately did not allow that fear to linger for very long. She had personally survived considerably worse than this before in her difficult life. She had survived far worse situations, with far fewer available resources than she currently possessed in this moment. She carefully examined the small room in the dim moonlight filtering faintly through the shuttered window, methodically searching for any genuine opportunity, any small weakness in her current captivity that she might possibly exploit to her advantage. The wooden shutters themselves, she discovered upon careful, patient inspection, were old and rather poorly maintained, the wood surrounding one particular hinge, soft and weakened with rot and considerable age. Working quietly and with great patience throughout the long, dark hours of that endless night, Lyra used a small, sharp fragment of stone she had discovered, wedged tightly into a crack in the wooden floorboards, to slowly, carefully work at the rotted wood surrounding the window's weakened hinge, always remaining mindful to pause completely whenever she happened to hear approaching footsteps or voices from somewhere beyond her locked door. Meanwhile, many long miles behind her, Draven rode hard at the very head of a determined, grim procession of guards, his powerful wolf barely contained beneath his own skin, his heightened senses straining desperately for any small trace of Lyra's familiar scent along the darkened roads stretching endlessly ahead. Oliver Finch rode close beside him throughout, and Charlotte Vale had firmly insisted on joining the urgent pursuit as well, her sharp intelligence and quick thinking proving genuinely invaluable as they worked together carefully to track the carriage's likely path through the darkness. The sudden commotion at the gathering was deliberately, carefully timed, Charlotte said, riding hard to keep proper pace with the king's furious, driven speed through the night. Whoever originally organized this entire scheme clearly knew exactly when to create that particular distraction, which strongly suggests careful advance planning and considerable inside knowledge of the evening's full schedule. Ravencrest, Draven growled deeply, his voice barely sounding human anymore, with barely restrained fury coursing through him. He personally warned me himself, cleverly disguised as simple concern for our safety. He told me directly that others would come seeking to test my claim over her, and I foolishly dismissed his warning at the time as nothing more than simple political theater. We do not know for certain yet that it was House Ravencrest responsible, Your Majesty, Oliver cautioned carefully, though his own tone suggested he shared the same growing suspicion. Though given Lord Ravencrest's rather evident, obvious interest in Miss Ashwood throughout both of his recent visits here, it certainly remains the single most likely explanation available to us. Then we ride hard and fast toward Ravencrest territory, Draven decided firmly, his voice leaving absolutely no room whatsoever for further argument or debate. If I happen to be wrong about this, we will have lost some valuable time searching. If I am right, then every single moment we delay only leaves her further and further within genuine danger's reach. They rode together through the remainder of that long night and steadily into the gray, misty hours before dawn finally broke, carefully following whatever scattered clues Charlotte and Oliver could manage to gather from various travelers and roadside inns along the likely route toward Ravencrest lands. Draven's wolf remained perpetually close to the surface throughout this entire desperate journey, his careful human composure fraying visibly more and more with each passing hour, that Lyra remained frustratingly beyond his reach. Back at the remote hunting lodge, Lyra finally succeeded in loosening the rotted wood around the window's weakened hinge, just as the very faintest hints of approaching dawn began slowly coloring the eastern sky outside. She worked the heavy shutter free with painstaking, deliberate care, carefully mindful of every small creak and groan the aging wood made, and slipped quietly through the narrow opening into the cool, crisp morning air waiting beyond. The dense forest surrounding the lodge stretched dark and entirely unfamiliar in every single direction around her, offering no clear indication whatsoever of which particular way might lead toward genuine safety, but Lyra did not hesitate for even a moment. She moved quickly and quietly through the surrounding trees, her still-bound wrists making the difficult journey considerably harder, though she had managed to work them somewhat looser during her long night of careful, patient effort. She had traveled perhaps a quarter-mile through the dense, tangled undergrowth, when the sudden sound of raised, angry voices from behind alerted her sharply to the fact that her absence had finally been discovered. Shouts echoed loudly through the surrounding trees, and the sound of urgent pursuit crashing noisily through the underbrush sent a fresh surge of pure adrenaline racing through her already exhausted body. She ran desperately, ignoring completely the sharp branches tearing painfully at her gown and exposed skin, ignoring the burning exhaustion steadily building in her tired legs, focused entirely and completely on putting as much distance as possible between herself and the lodge now behind her. The forest floor sloped gradually downward toward what she genuinely hoped might be a stream or river somewhere ahead, some natural feature that might help disguise her fleeing trail or offer a clearer path toward eventual safety and civilization. She had very nearly reached the welcome sound of rushing water when a strong hand suddenly closed roughly around her upper arm, spinning her backward with enough considerable force to knock the breath entirely from her lungs. Edward Ravencrest stood directly before her now, his previously composed charm entirely gone, replaced instead by cold, calculating anger, written plainly across his sharp features. "That particular attempt was rather foolish, Miss Ashwood," he said, his grip tightening painfully around her captured arm. "Foolish, and ultimately quite futile in the end. Did you genuinely believe you could successfully outrun trained trackers through completely unfamiliar territory, bound tightly and entirely alone as you are? I believed I would far rather risk absolutely everything trying to escape than remain simply a passive prisoner, waiting quietly for others to decide my entire fate for me." Lyra spat back defiantly, refusing to let genuine fear overtake the fierce, burning defiance still coursing through her exhausted body. Edward's expression shifted rapidly into something considerably colder and more genuinely dangerous than she had ever witnessed from him before this moment. "Perhaps I have seriously underestimated the sheer difficulty involved in managing you quietly," he said coldly. "Very well then, we will simply need to adjust our current plan accordingly." He began forcefully dragging her back toward the distant lodge, his firm grip bruising painfully against her captured arm, and Lyra fought back against him with every single remaining ounce of strength she still possessed, twisting and pulling desperately against his powerful hold, absolutely refusing to make this easy for him despite the clear futility of her continued resistance against his considerably superior physical strength. It was in the very midst of this desperate struggle that a powerful sound suddenly cut sharply through the quiet forest air, a deep, furious howl that seemed to genuinely shake the very trees surrounding them both, unmistakably the sound of an enraged alpha wolf rapidly closing in with truly terrifying speed and purpose. Edward's head snapped instantly toward the sudden sound, his previously composed confidence finally cracking wide open into genuine, visible alarm. "That simply cannot be possible," he muttered under his breath. "There is absolutely no possible way he could have traced us here this quickly." But the powerful sound came again, considerably closer this time, accompanied now by the thunder of rapidly approaching hooves and the shouts of Draven's swiftly pursuing guard, and Lyra felt a wild, desperate surge of genuine hope crash suddenly through her exhaustion, immediately recognizing in that furious, echoing howl the unmistakable sound of the man who had promised her just days before, that he would find her again no matter what it ultimately took from him. "Let her go now," Edward's remaining guard called out nervously, already backing steadily away toward the safety of the tree line. That is unmistakably the king's own voice, carried within that wolf's furious cry. "We are completely outmatched here, my lord." Edward's tight grip on Lyra's arm tightened one final desperate moment, his sharp eyes rapidly calculating some last, desperate advantage available to him, before the massive gray form of Draven's wolf burst suddenly through the tree line with truly terrifying speed and barely controlled fury. And Edward, finally recognizing the complete hopelessness of his current position, released Lyra entirely and stumbled backward in fear, his hands raised in a clear gesture of surrender that did remarkably little to calm the murderous rage clearly burning within the wolf's molten golden eyes. Lyra collapsed weakly to her knees at the sudden release, overwhelming exhaustion and profound relief crashing over her simultaneously, watching intently as Draven's massive wolf form circled Edward slowly, with barely contained fury, every single line of his powerful body radiating the clear promise of imminent violence, held back only by the very thinnest remaining thread of his rapidly fraying control. "Draven," Lyra called out weakly, her voice hoarse but remarkably steady. "He is genuinely not worth the serious consequences of whatever you are currently considering doing to him. Let your guards handle him properly instead." For one long, tense, suspended moment, the massive wolf remained completely frozen in place, his golden eyes still fixed intently on Edward with barely restrained fury, before slowly, gradually, the massive form began to steadily shrink and shift, until Draven himself stood before her once again, breathing hard and heavy, his bare chest heaving visibly with the sheer effort of forcibly restraining his wolf's murderous, violent instincts. "Bind him securely," Draven ordered the guards, now rapidly flooding into the small clearing behind him, his voice rough and hoarse, but carrying absolute, unquestionable authority throughout. "He will answer directly to the full council for this grave offense, and to every single neighboring house that genuinely values the fragile peace he has just so completely shattered beyond any easy repair." As his guards moved quickly to properly secure Edward Ravencrest, Draven crossed the small clearing rapidly, and dropped immediately to his knees beside Lyra, gathering her carefully and gently into his strong arms, his hands trembling slightly as he checked her over carefully for any serious injury hidden beneath the visible scratches and bruises, marking her exhausted, trembling body. "I am all right," Lyra whispered softly, leaning gratefully into his warm embrace, despite her overwhelming exhaustion. Profound relief washing steadily through her, in powerful waves, as she finally allowed herself to feel genuinely safe again, after the long, thoroughly terrifying ordeal she had just survived. "You actually found me. You truly came for me." "I told you that I would," Draven murmured softly against her hair, holding her close with a fierce, deeply protective tenderness that spoke far louder than any words ever possibly could have managed to express. "I promised you this, and I will always, always keep that solemn promise to you, whatever it ultimately takes from me to do so." All around them, the quiet forest slowly grew peaceful once more, as Edward Ravencrest was firmly secured and led away toward whatever formal reckoning now awaited him, and Lyra remained safely held within Draven's strong, protective arms, the long, terrifying night finally, blessedly coming to its peaceful end at last. The journey back to Ashenmoor took the better part of 2 full days, and Lyra spent much of that quiet time wrapped snugly in a warm cloak, riding closely beside Draven, her body slowly recovering from the exhaustion and lingering fear of her recent ordeal, while her mind carefully worked through everything that had happened to her. Edward Ravencrest rode bound and completely silent near the rear of their long procession, closely guarded by 4 of Draven's most trusted men, his earlier easy confidence now entirely extinguished from his sharp features. When they finally passed through Ashenmoor's familiar gates once more, word of their safe return had already spread quickly throughout the entire palace, and a large crowd had gathered eagerly in the courtyard, servants and nobles alike watching with anxious anticipation as the king dismounted quickly and helped Lyra carefully down from her horse with obvious, gentle tenderness. Beatrice Calloway stood waiting near the front of the gathered crowd, and Lyra braced herself immediately for renewed suspicion or further political maneuvering, genuinely uncertain what exactly to expect after everything that had recently transpired between them. Instead, Calloway stepped forward calmly and offered a formal, entirely genuine bow. Your Majesty, Miss Ashwood, I am truly relieved beyond words to see you both safely return to us. Lady Calloway, Draven said carefully, still somewhat uncertain of her true intentions. I confess, I fully expected further pointed questions upon our return, not this genuine relief you are showing us. I still hold many questions, Your Majesty, Calloway admitted honestly, but I have also spent the past 2 full days carefully reviewing every single piece of evidence gathered regarding this entire situation, and I have genuinely come to understand something I perhaps failed to properly appreciate before all of this happened. She turned to look directly at Lyra. My original concerns were never truly about Miss Ashwood's own character. They were always about properly protecting this kingdom from outside manipulation and visible weakness. Watching Lord Ravencrest's shocking betrayal unfold before us has shown me quite clearly that the greater genuine danger to Ashenmoor's stability lies not within Miss Ashwood's quiet presence here, but rather in the dangerous assumption that fear and suspicion alone can somehow protect us from those who would eagerly exploit any perceived weakness they find. Lyra studied the older woman carefully, searching closely for any hidden agenda lurking behind her carefully chosen words, and found instead what genuinely appeared to be sincere, if rather hard-won, honest reconsideration. Thank you, Lady Calloway, she said finally, meaning it sincerely. I understand now that your concerns were never truly personal, even when they certainly felt that way to me at the time. They were never meant to be personal against you, Calloway confirmed firmly, though I do recognize now that my particular methods may have caused you unnecessary difficulty during an already quite difficult time for everyone involved. For that specific failing, I offer you my sincere and heartfelt apology. Draven nodded slowly at this, some of the lingering tension between them easing considerably at Calloway's honest, heartfelt acknowledgement. Your continued faithful service to this council remains genuinely valued, Lady Calloway, provided your future concerns going forward are raised with fairness rather than simple suspicion. Understood completely, Your Majesty, Calloway said, bowing once more respectfully, before stepping quietly back into the gathered crowd around them. Edward Ravencrest was brought formally before the full council within just a few short days, and the considerable evidence gathered against him proved entirely overwhelming and completely undeniable to everyone present. Formal charges were officially levied against House Ravencrest for the deliberate abduction of a royal protected individual, a serious violation severe enough to genuinely threaten the very foundation of peace so carefully maintained between the various houses for 3 full generations. Edward himself was formally stripped of his noble title and standing, his ultimate fate left entirely in the hands of his own extended family, who moved quickly and decisively to distance themselves entirely from his reckless actions in order to preserve whatever remained of their own family's political standing among the other houses. With the immediate danger now fully resolved, and the considerable political fallout beginning its own slow process of finally settling down, Draven called Lyra to his private study one particularly quiet evening, several weeks after her dramatic rescue, the familiar fire, burning warm and steady in the hearth, exactly as it had on that very first extraordinary day, when everything between them had changed so completely and so suddenly. I have been thinking carefully, Draven said gently, taking her hand softly in his own, about absolutely everything that has happened since that very first morning in the garden, about the deep fear you have carried for so very long, and the genuine courage you showed while facing every single danger that followed after that. As have I, truly, Lyra admitted softly, meeting his warm gaze. I do not wish to rush you in any way, Draven continued carefully, and I meant every single word I said earlier about allowing you the complete freedom to choose this path entirely for yourself, in your own good time. But I find myself feeling genuinely certain, more certain than I have felt about almost anything else in my entire life, that I want to formally claim you, not because politics or council pressure demands it of me, but because my own heart has already made that particular choice long ago, quietly and completely. Lyra felt warm tears gathering steadily in her eyes, not from fear this time, but from something considerably warmer and far more hopeful than she had ever allowed herself to genuinely feel, in longer than she could remember. I have spent my entire life believing that genuine safety meant hiding myself away completely, she said softly, Believing that being truly seen, being genuinely known by others, made me dangerously vulnerable to everything that had already taken so very much from me before. But these past several weeks have taught me something entirely different from that old belief. Being truly seen by you, genuinely seen, has never once made me feel weaker in any way. It has made me feel, for the very first time in my life, genuinely whole. Is that meant to be a yes, then? Draven asked, a warm, hopeful smile touching his lips gently. That is absolutely a yes, Lyra confirmed, laughing softly through her happy tears. The formal bonding ceremony took place beneath the wide-open sky exactly 3 weeks later, held in that very same courtyard, where absolutely everything had first begun for them both, surrounded closely by members of the royal court, several allied houses, and countless palace staff who had come to genuinely know and deeply respect the quiet inner strength Lyra had demonstrated so clearly throughout every single trial she had faced along the way. Grace Whitmore stood proudly among the gathered witnesses, standing alongside Oliver Finch, Charlotte Vale, and even Victor Hale, whose original sentence had been thoughtfully reduced to a period of honest, dedicated service in recognition of his genuine cooperation and sincere remorse for his earlier actions. As the ceremony finally concluded and Draven formally declared Lyra his true Luna before the entire assembled court, a solemn declaration that would soon be shared openly with every neighboring house as an unbreakable, permanent statement of their bond together, the gathered crowd erupted into genuine, joyful celebration, a warmth and pure happiness that Lyra had never once imagined might someday surround her so openly, entirely without fear or the need for any hiding. In the peaceful weeks that followed the ceremony, Lyra returned often to the Eastern Garden, now fully restored and considerably expanded under her own careful, loving direction, no longer serving as a hidden place of desperate survival, but instead, flourishing as a beautiful, open space welcoming the entire palace, filled abundantly with herbs and flowers of every single kind imaginable, tended now not out of any lingering fear, but purely out of genuine, peaceful love for the quiet, patient work of nurturing growing things over time. Draven often joined her there quietly during the early mornings, watching her work with that same quiet sense of wonder he had felt on that very first extraordinary day, when a mysterious scent he could not initially explain had first led him directly to the truth of a remarkable woman who had ultimately changed everything he thought he had once understood about his own life. "Any genuine regrets?" he asked her softly, one such peaceful morning, watching closely as she carefully tended a neat row of newly planted silverleaf, no longer needed at all for any kind of disguise, but grown now simply for its own natural beauty and gentle, pleasant fragrance. Lyra looked up slowly at him, this remarkable king who had once unknowingly destroyed her only hiding place, and had, in doing so, ultimately given her something far more valuable than any simple disguise ever truly could have provided her. A genuine life built openly on honest truth, deep mutual trust, and a profound love she had never once believed herself truly worthy of finding for herself. "None whatsoever," she said softly, smiling warmly up at him, "not even a single one." And as the warm morning sun rose fully and completely over Ashenmoor's now peaceful gardens, Lyra finally understood, with quiet, unshakable certainty, that the very herbs which had once desperately protected her from a dangerous world had finally, truly given way to something considerably far stronger than any disguise. A genuine life lived openly and honestly, standing proudly beside a king who had proven, through every single trial they had faced bravely together side by side, that some precious bonds were genuinely worth far more than any carefully guarded secret could ever possibly be.